Welcome to Terrified Tales, where things are about to get unsettling. Before we dive deeper into the darkness, make sure to like and subscribe. Let us know where you're listening from and what time it is. Are you brave enough to be here at night? Now, relax and let the fear take hold. The evening air was crisp, laced with a peculiar chill that seemed to cling to the skin. The kind of cold that shouldn't have been there at all, not on a night when laughter and celebration should have filled the air. The mansion, towering above, the darkened hill like some abandoned titan, seemed to take a deep breath of anticipation as its guests arrived. Its old, dark windows reflected the dimming light of dusk, catching the last golden rays of the setting sun before the darkness took hold. As the carriages and cars pulled up the winding road to the front door, it was clear that the group of friends had come to celebrate. They had reunited for the first time in years, and the mansion, once the home of a wealthy industrialist, long since forgotten, was their gathering place for this special occasion. The plan was simple: a night of fun, a night of nostalgia, a celebration of what they used to be, and the beginning of a new year. "I still can't believe we're all here," Claire said, her voice tinged with a mixture of excitement and nervousness. "I mean, it feels like we were all just kids yesterday, doesn't it?" She took a long look at the mansion looming before them, the massive stone structure with ivy crawling up the sides. Its eerie presence contrasted with the lively spirits of the group, and Claire couldn't help but feel a little uneasy. "Well, we sure don't feel like kids anymore," Matt responded with a laugh, his voice echoing a familiar bravado, though even he seemed taken aback by the house's imposing structure. "Look at this place. It's like something out of a horror movie." The rest of the group laughed as they climbed out of the vehicles, their footsteps crunching on the gravel driveway. There were 6 of them in total: Claire, Matt, Charlotte, James, Sarah, and Alex. All were college friends, reunited after years of pursuing different paths in life. They had all agreed to come here, to this forgotten mansion, for one last hurrah. There was no other way to ring in the new year than to do so with the people they knew best, no matter how strange the place. Their laughter soon faded as they approached the massive oak doors, which creaked open with an air of unsettling familiarity. The butler, a gaunt and stoic man named Gregory, stood at the door awaiting them. His pale face barely acknowledged the group as he ushered them in with a polite but dispassionate bow. There was no warmth in his greeting, but then again the mansion seemed to lack warmth altogether. Inside, the grand entry hall greeted them with high ceilings, dark wood paneling, and an array of strange antiques that had once been impressive, but now felt like forgotten relics. A giant chandelier hung from the center of the room, its lights flickering faintly as the group filed in. "You'll find the ballroom through here," Gregory said, gesturing to the right. "Your host is waiting for you." The group moved toward the ballroom, each member silently absorbing the mansion's oppressive atmosphere. The vast space felt ancient and endless, the stone floors cold beneath their shoes. Despite the excitement in the air, there was something off about the mansion. The silence was too heavy. The house was too still. As they entered the ballroom, the warmth of the celebration surrounded them, providing a stark contrast to the gloom of the hallway they had just left. A lavish spread of food and drink covered the long banquet table, and a small orchestra played a quiet waltz in the background. But still, the weight of the mansion lingered, as though the house itself was watching them, waiting. The host, an elderly man with silver hair and a thick accent, stood near the grand fireplace. He was impeccably dressed in a black suit, his eyes sharp and calculating. The others gathered around him, offering polite introductions, but he barely acknowledged their presence, as if he were already aware of who they were. There was something unsettling in the way he looked at them, as though he could see straight through them, beyond their smiles and laughter. "Welcome," he said in a voice that echoed slightly, as though bouncing off the stone walls. "I trust your journey was pleasant?" "Quite," Alex responded, always the one to break the ice. It's a beautiful place, though I'll admit it feels a little, I don't know, eerie. The host's lips twitched, a small, knowing smile crossing his face. "Ah, yes," he murmured, his eyes darkening slightly. "This mansion has that effect on people. You will soon learn that it is not like other houses. It has its own nature, its own rhythm, its own rules." "Rules?" Charlotte echoed, arching an eyebrow. "What kind of rules?" The host looked at her, his eyes narrowing as if weighing his words carefully. "There is one rule I must ask you to follow during your stay. Never enter the mansion after sunset. Do not venture into certain parts of the house when the sun goes down. If you do, you may never leave." The warning, though delivered with a smile, sent a chill down their spines. The group laughed nervously, thinking it a mere superstition or a bizarre quirk of their host, but the seriousness in his eyes was impossible to ignore. "It's a joke, right?" Matt said with a nervous chuckle. "We're supposed to be celebrating tonight, not getting stuck in some ghost story." The host, however, remained silent for a long moment. His eyes scanned the group, lingering on each of them, as if trying to judge their reactions. Finally, he spoke again. "The mansion has its secrets," he said quietly, almost to himself. "And not all things are meant to be disturbed. Please, enjoy the evening, but do keep that in mind." An awkward silence followed. The others exchanged uneasy glances, unsure of what to make of the host's cryptic words. But the atmosphere of the ballroom soon overtook their thoughts. The music resumed, the guests began to mingle, and the unease faded, at least for the moment. As the night unfolded, the group tried to ignore the tension that hung in the air, focusing instead on their reunion. Laughter and conversation filled the vast space as the hours passed, but beneath it all, the house seemed to hum with an energy that none of them could fully understand. The mansion's strange rules were not to be forgotten, but for now, they buried their worries and allowed themselves to enjoy the night. Still, as midnight drew closer, the same unsettling sense of something not quite right began to creep back into their minds. The chandeliers flickered, and a strange coldness seeped into the room, though the fire burned brightly in the hearth. A gust of wind howled from somewhere deep within the mansion, and the door to the ballroom rattled as if someone was waiting just beyond it. But the countdown continued. 10, 9, 8. The excitement in the air was palpable, though something darker had begun to overshadow it. The group's laughter, their playful teasing and joking, now seemed forced, a thin veneer masking a creeping tension none of them were willing to admit. Despite the opulent surroundings, the grandeur of the ballroom, and the fine food and drink that filled the long tables, an unease had settled over the room. It was as if the house itself was waiting for something, holding its breath, and they were part of some unseen ritual they couldn't yet comprehend. Charlotte stood by one of the tall windows, looking out at the storm beginning to roll in from the horizon. The once clear skies had turned an ominous shade of grey, clouds clumping together in a violent swirl as the wind began to pick up. The house, isolated on its perch atop a lonely hill, felt all the more remote as the air grew thick with the impending storm. She pulled her shawl tighter around her shoulders, more out of instinct than need. "Are you okay?" Claire's voice broke through her thoughts. Charlotte turned to see her friend approach with a glass of champagne in hand, a forced smile on her lips. "Just feeling the weight of this place," Charlotte replied with a shrug, her eyes still, drawn to the storm outside. "It's hard to explain. I've never been to a place like this." Claire nodded slowly, her eyes flicking nervously around the room. "Yeah, there's definitely something off about it. The way everything's so grand, but empty. I don't know how to describe it." Charlotte smiled faintly, appreciating that Claire understood what she meant. "Exactly. It feels like the house is waiting for something. I don't know about all that, Matt chimed in from across the room. His voice had the usual edge of humor, but even he couldn't entirely hide the tension creeping into his words. It's just a creepy old mansion. What did we expect? The clock on the far wall ticked loudly, as if the room itself was participating in the countdown. With every passing second, the weight of the evening seemed to grow heavier. As midnight drew nearer, the temperature in the ballroom began to drop. At first, it was a subtle change, the warm air growing just slightly colder. But it wasn't long before the group started to notice the discomfort settling into their bones. The fire in the hearth, which had been burning brightly since they arrived, seemed to flicker and dim, though no one dared to approach it. Did anyone else feel that? Alex asked, a hint of nervousness in his voice. His hands gripped the back of a chair as he looked around the room, his eyes darting from person to person. I swear, the temperature just dropped like 10 degrees. Yeah, I thought it was. Just me, Claire admitted, pulling her cardigan tighter around her. It's getting colder. Where's the warmth from the fire? I'll go check on it, James said, his voice reassuring but unsteady as he crossed the room toward the fireplace. His steps echoed too loudly on the marble floors, and his breath came out in a soft mist. The fire crackled softly as he approached, but as he peered into the hearth, he froze. What's wrong? Sarah asked, walking over to him. She was always the one to jump into the fray, unafraid of the things that unsettled the others. There's no heat, James replied, leaning in closer to the fire, his brow furrowing. It's just smoke. The logs aren't burning right. It's like the air's just stopping the fire from warming up. Okay, that's weird, Matt muttered, walking over to join them. This place is just messing with us now. I mean, we all saw that flicker with the lights earlier, right? And now this. The group gathered around the fire, each of them instinctively shivering as the temperature continued to drop. The warmth of the evening had vanished, leaving a bitter cold that made every movement feel sluggish and unnatural. As they stood there, the sound of the wind howling outside grew louder, pushing at the walls of the mansion as if attempting to break through. Then, just as the clock struck 10, the lights flickered. It was subtle at first. A momentary stutter. In the chandelier above, a brief dip in the light before it returned to its usual brightness. But within seconds, the flickering grew more intense. The chandeliers swayed, casting long, twisting shadows across the room. The group exchanged uneasy glances as the subtle hum of electricity flickered in and out, the dimming lights playing tricks on their eyes. All right, that's enough, Matt said, his voice shaky now as he moved toward the grand piano in the corner of the room. This isn't funny anymore. Seriously, someone better explain what's going on before I get out of here. Before anyone could respond, the clock on the wall chimed. The deep, resonant sound echoed through the room. But then, something strange happened. The tick-tock of the clock slowed. It was as though time itself had lost its rhythm. The tick of the clock became languid, drawn out. Each passing second seemed to stretch impossibly long, each tick lingering in the air as if waiting for something. The room seemed to grow heavy with the sound, the once cheerful ambiance of the party now fading into something oppressive and thick. I think we should go check on the host, Alex said, his voice tight with unease. Maybe we're just not getting the full vibe of this place and he knows what's going on. The others nodded reluctantly, their steps hesitant, as they moved to the far side of the ballroom, where the host had taken a seat earlier in front of the fireplace. The mansion seemed to close in around them as they crossed the vast space, the weight of the air growing thicker with every step. Their movements felt sluggish, as if they were moving through water, and the house itself seemed to grow darker, the shadows pooling deeper than before. They reached the fireplace where the host had been seated, but when they arrived, he was nowhere to be found. The large armchair where he had sat earlier was empty. His glass of wine still sat beside it, untouched. but he was gone. The fire burned low, its embers sputtering and flickering as if struggling to stay alive, and the room around them seemed to groan under an invisible pressure. "What the hell?" James muttered. "Where did he go?" "I don't know," Claire whispered. "This place is seriously starting to freak me out. We should leave, now." Matt, always the skeptic, shook his head. "Come on, don't let it get to you. It's just a big old house. Nothing's wrong." But just as he said that, a cold gust of air swept through the room, chilling them to the bone. The temperature had dropped even further, and now it felt as though the very walls of the mansion were breathing in and out, alive with an ancient, unseen force. Outside, the storm intensified. The rain began to pound against the windows, and the wind howled so loudly that it seemed to drown out all other sounds. The very foundations of the mansion seemed to be shaking. And then the lights flickered again. This time, they didn't return. The ballroom plunged into darkness. A collective gasp escaped from the group as the room was swallowed by a suffocating blackness. The warmth of the house was gone, replaced by a bone-deep cold that made their breath visible in the air. The silence in the room was absolute, broken only by the distant sound of the storm outside and the echo of their own breathing. They huddled together, their senses heightened as their eyes adjusted to the blackness. "What the hell is going on?" Sarah asked, her voice tight with panic. "This isn't normal." "It's not just the lights," Charlotte whispered. "It's something else. Something about this house. Something is wrong here." The wind outside howled louder, and then the clock struck again. But this time the sound was wrong. The chime that followed the strike was distorted, warped, as though the mansion itself was mocking the passage of time. The seconds ticked by slowly, painfully slowly, and the group felt as though they were slipping into another world, one where time didn't move the way they remembered. And that's when it happened. The moment the clock struck midnight, the house froze. Time stopped. The fireworks that had been promised outside the mansion never appeared. The loud rumble of thunder was silenced. The tick-tock of the clock ceased altogether, leaving only the heavy, unnatural silence in its wake. The air itself seemed to still, as though the very essence of time had come to a standstill. Everything was locked in place, unmoving, suspended in a moment that stretched far beyond any normal sense of time. The group stood motionless, unsure of what was happening. They looked around the room, their minds racing. Was this some kind of prank? Had the host planned this as part of the experience, or was it something darker, something they couldn't begin to understand? And then they realized there was no sound, no music, no whispers, no clock ticking. The world outside seemed to have disappeared, leaving them alone in the mansion, alone and frozen. Just as they were about to voice their confusion, the temperature dropped even further. The cold was unbearable now, as though something was draining the warmth from their bodies. A soft whisper filled the room, so faint it might have been imagined. But it wasn't. It was real. A voice, as cold and distant as the storm outside, seemed to speak from the walls themselves. "You're too late." The group froze. Their hearts pounded in their chests as the temperature plummeted even further, and the sense of impending doom began to gnaw at them. And that's when they realized whatever had been waiting for this moment had now begun. The first sign came when the clocks resumed ticking, but the world around them did not return to normal. The chimes, once clear and precise, were warped, stretched out into distorted echoes, and the second hand on the clock dragged painfully across the face. Time itself seemed to be moving in fits and starts, like a broken machine, unable to synchronize itself with the natural world. The group stood there in the cold, suspended moment, their eyes wide in shock, their breaths shallow, as they tried to understand the magnitude of what was happening. For a moment, no one moved. No one spoke. The absolute stillness hung heavy in the air, making each breath feel like a foreign intrusion into the otherwise oppressive silence. And then, with a sudden crackle of energy, the lights returned. But it wasn't like before. They flickered once, twice, then stayed bright, casting long, unnerving shadows on the walls. The warmth slowly returned to the room, but it wasn't the same warmth. It was an unnatural heat, like the air was charged with an unseen energy, something dark, something malevolent. What the hell just happened? James finally broke the silence, his voice tight with panic. His eyes darted to the clock on the wall, which ticked slowly, almost languidly. Did the clocks did they stop? Like, completely? I thought we were frozen in time. Charlotte took a deep breath, trying to steady herself. She had felt it too. The sudden shift in the air, the way time seemed to twist and bend. She could feel the house now more than ever, watching them, holding them captive in its strange grip. The temperature had dropped so much during the freeze, but now it was warmer, too warm. It was as if the mansion itself was responding to the disturbance. I think it's trying to control us, Charlotte whispered, the words tasting strange on her tongue. The house, it's alive. It's doing something to time. It's like it's playing with us. I'm not so sure about that, Matt said, forcing a laugh, but it came out sounding more hollow than he intended. It's all a little weird, yeah, but we're still here, aren't we? We're not dead, are we? I don't know about you, Alex said, his voice shaking with the realization that something far beyond their control was at play. But something's definitely wrong. I've never felt anything like this in my life. Maybe we should go check on the host again, Claire suggested, her eyes still wide with uncertainty. I don't trust the silence in here anymore. He said this house had rules. Maybe there's more to it than we thought. Just then, as if on cue, the air seemed to thicken. It became harder to breathe, as though the house was pressing in on them, suffocating them. The shadows in the corners of the room stretched out unnaturally, long, twisting and twirling as if trying to reach for them. The faintest sound of whispers began to fill the room, low and insistent, just beneath the threshold of hearing. They couldn't make out the words, but they were there. The voices, soft, indistinct, and almost maddening in their persistence, seemed to surround them, echoing off the walls, growing louder with every passing second. "What's that?" Sarah asked, her eyes darting around the room. She took a step back, bumping into a chair, the sharp screech of its legs scraping across the floor, making the hairs on the back of her neck stand on end. "What?" Matt asked. "What are you talking about?" The whispers seemed to surge, suddenly much clearer. The group could now hear phrases, distorted, broken sentences, floating through the air. "Leave now. You're not welcome here. Time is not your ally." The words were not spoken by any human voice. They seemed to come from everywhere and nowhere at once, echoing from the walls, from the ceilings, from the very air itself. "I told you," Charlotte said, her voice steady but with a growing sense of dread. "The house, it knows us. It's watching us. It's feeding off of us." Matt, visibly shaken, glanced at the others, his mind racing. "I don't know what this is anymore, but I don't think we should wait around to find out. We need to leave." "Don't you hear it?" Claire whispered, her voice trembling. "The house is alive. It's playing with us. We need to find the host," Alex said, his voice rising with urgency. "We need to understand what the hell is going on. He warned us about this place for a reason." And just as quickly as the whispers had come, they stopped. The silence returned, but now it felt heavier, more oppressive. The group stood frozen for a moment, staring at one another, trying to comprehend what they had just experienced. "Let's go," Charlotte said, her voice firm. "We need answers. The longer we stay here, the more it's messing with us. We're not safe." They moved cautiously toward the grand staircase at the far end of the ballroom, the steps creaking under their weight as they ascended. The house felt like it was breathing around them, the walls seeming to contract and expand with each step they took. The shadows around them lengthened, growing darker and more restless, as if the house itself were aware of their movement. As they reached the second floor, they found the hallways darker, colder. The rooms along the corridor were closed, their doors slightly ajar, revealing nothing but emptiness. The silence was almost suffocating now, and the air was thick with the smell of dust and something older, something faintly metallic and decayed. The group paused in front of a large, ornate door, which stood at the end of the hall. It was the door to the host's quarters. They could see the faintest glow of light coming from underneath, but as they approached, the whispers began again, fainter this time, but still unmistakable. Stay away. It knows you're here. Ignoring the voices, they pushed the door open, their breath catching in their throats as they stepped inside. The room was lavish but sparse, its grandness diminished by the oppressive aura that hung in the air. The host's large desk stood near a window, the curtains drawn tight, blocking any view of the storm outside. The host, however, was nowhere to be found. At first it seemed like the room was untouched, but upon closer inspection the group could see small signs of disturbance. Books lay haphazardly on the desk, their spines cracked as if someone had searched through them in a hurry. Papers were strewn across the floor, some fluttering as though a breeze had passed through, though the air was dead still. And then, something caught Charlotte's eye. On the far wall, a large portrait of a family hung. The painting was elegant, with the family dressed in fine clothing, standing together in front of the mansion. They looked poised and composed, perfect in fact. But the faces, there was something wrong with them. The eyes of the figures were too wide, their expressions too still, like frozen mannequins. It was as if they were staring at the group, watching them with an unnatural intensity. Charlotte stepped closer, her breath catching in her chest. "This is wrong," she murmured. "This whole place is wrong. Maybe we should leave," Sarah said, her voice trembling as she stepped away from the painting. But just as she spoke those words, the temperature in the room dropped again, this time so violently that their breath turned to mist in front of them. A cold wind swept through the room, despite the closed windows, and the door slammed shut behind them. They spun around, startled by the sudden shift in the atmosphere. The room had become unnaturally dark, and as they looked around, the lights overhead flickered and died. For a moment, the group was enveloped in a thick, suffocating darkness, the air becoming almost unbearable. And then they heard it, the soft sound of footsteps coming from the far side of the room. One by one, the group turned toward the sound. The footsteps grew louder, coming closer. And then, out of the darkness, a figure emerged. It was the host. But his appearance was different now. His face was pale, gaunt, with hollow eyes that seemed to look through them, not at them. He was no longer dressed in his fine suit, but in tattered robes, and his movements were jerky, like a marionette controlled by strings. "Get away from him," Charlotte whispered, her voice barely audible. The group backed away, fear spreading like wildfire through their bodies. The host raised a trembling hand toward them, and with a voice that was both his and not his, he spoke. "You should not have come." The air outside was heavy with the weight of the storm. The wind howled across the hill, bending the trees and rattling the windows of the mansion. The cold had wrapped its fingers around the house, seeping into the bones of the structure. Inside, the group had gathered in the hallway, huddling together near the grand staircase. Their breaths still came out in small puffs of mist, and the oppressive silence that surrounded them made every sound feel too loud. Charlotte stood at the window, her eyes scanning the storm. The sky had darkened significantly, and though the rain had been pouring down for hours, It had become strangely still. The sky, once filled with flashing bolts of lightning, now appeared to be frozen in place. The clouds, dark and angry, seemed to hold their breath, and the distant thunder had become an unnerving hum, barely noticeable yet insistent. It was almost as if the weather had become an extension of the house itself, locked in a moment, waiting for something to happen. What's wrong with the sky? What's wrong with the... Charlotte asked quietly, more to herself than to anyone else. It doesn't look right. What do you mean? Alex asked, his voice tense. Look. Charlotte pointed to the sky, her finger trembling slightly. The stars, they're not where they should be. It's like they've shifted position. The group fell silent, all of them turning toward the window. The stars in the sky, which had once formed recognizable constellations, were now all wrong. They were too close, too bright, and far too scattered. They blinked erratically, as though they were blinking in and out of existence. The night sky had been rearranged, the familiar constellations now unrecognizable. The universe itself seemed to be mocking them. It's just a trick of the light, right? Matt said, his voice unsure. But Charlotte wasn't convinced. She had felt it earlier, that strange sense of being pulled into the wrong moment in time. This was different. This wasn't just a glitch in the mansion's design. This was something far more sinister, far more dangerous. The stars, those ancient, unchanging symbols of navigation and time, were now defying the natural laws of the universe. Something was off. This isn't right, she whispered, more to herself than anyone else. The house, the time, and now this. We've entered something else. We're not in the world we know anymore. The wind outside had picked up again, a high-pitched wail that rattled the windows. It sounded like a voice, something calling from far away, something ancient, something powerful. The group instinctively drew closer to one another, unsure whether they were being drawn in by the wind, or if the house itself was doing something to them. They were caught between two worlds, and the mansion had no intention of letting them leave. Maybe it's just a storm, James suggested, though his voice faltered with doubt. Maybe the house is just messing with our heads. We've been in here too long. We're just tired. I'm not so sure, Alex replied. This place has felt wrong from the start. Everything's out of place. And now the stars are wrong, Charlotte added softly, her voice trembling. I don't think we can just chalk it up to our imaginations anymore. They stood in silence for a moment, the sound of the wind outside becoming louder. Then it happened. With a sudden crack, the windows shattered. The room was filled with the sharp, piercing sound of breaking glass as the storm crashed into the mansion. It wasn't like a normal gust of wind. It was as if the storm itself had been unleashed with a single violent force, its anger erupting in a way that no one had ever experienced. The air turned icy as the cold, damp wind flooded into the room, blowing papers and debris around the hallway. The group flinched back, instinctively shielding themselves from the barrage of wind and broken glass. Get away from the windows! Claire screamed. Get away from the windows! They scrambled, their feet slipping on the marble floors as they moved farther into the hall. But the wind didn't stop. It grew stronger, pulling at them, pushing them toward the center of the house, like an unseen hand gripping their bodies and dragging them deeper into its grip. And then, as quickly as it had begun, it stopped. The wind vanished entirely, leaving a deafening silence behind. The temperature dropped even further, and the cold that followed was no longer natural. It was like the house itself had become a frozen, hollow place, its heart beating no longer with warmth, but with the coldness of something ancient and unyielding. They stood there in the center of the hall, shaking, uncertain as the shattered windows flickered with unnatural light, casting strange reflections on the walls. What the hell just happened? Matt gasped, his eyes wide. The house is playing with us, Alex said, trying to steady his voice. It's been doing this from the start, and I think it's only just getting started. What's the deal with the windows? Claire asked, eyes darting to the jagged pieces of glass scattered across the floor. They weren't even open. How did that happen? I don't know, Charlotte replied, her voice low and anxious. But we need to get to the bottom of this. If the house can do this to the weather, then it's not going to stop until it has us. The group stood for a long moment, unsure of what to do next. Then, just as Charlotte was about to speak, a sound echoed from upstairs. A creak, a thump. It came from somewhere deeper in the mansion, somewhere far from the ballroom and the hallway they were standing in. It sounded like footsteps, slow and deliberate, moving through the house. Without thinking, the group moved toward the sound, drawn to it like moths to a flame. They walked in near silence, the air thick with anticipation, the only sound being their footsteps as they moved through the grand hallway, past dark doors and vacant rooms. The second-floor landing seemed to stretch before them, impossibly long, like a hallway that had no end. At the far end, a single door stood ajar, an unnatural light seeping through the crack. The door led to a room where the light was brighter than the rest of the house. There was something inviting yet utterly terrifying about it, a pull that tugged at their minds. They approached the door, their bodies tense, but no one spoke. As they reached it, the light flickered once more, a brief flash of intense brightness before it returned to its usual dim glow. "I don't like this," James muttered, his voice tight with unease. "We should turn back." But Charlotte moved, closer to the door, her hand slowly pushing it open. The room inside was like something out of a nightmare. It wasn't a normal room by any means. It was a study, a library perhaps, but the shelves were empty, save for a few scattered books that seemed to be untouched by time. The light in the room flickered again, brighter and then dimming, casting distorted shadows on the walls. The air in here felt wrong, static, as if something had been waiting for them. A large desk sat in the center of the room, and on it, a single book lay open, its pages glowing faintly. The book appeared old, bound in dark leather, the pages yellowed and curling at the edges. "What is this place?" Claire whispered, her eyes wide. Charlotte stepped forward, her gaze drawn to the book. As she reached out to touch it, the air seemed to grow heavier, colder, and suddenly a voice echoed in her mind. "Time is not your ally. You are already too far gone." The voice was not the host's. It wasn't anyone she knew. It was ancient, distorted like the house itself had spoken to her through the pages of the book. She stumbled back, gasping for breath, her heart racing as the words continued to echo in her mind. "What the hell was that?" Matt asked, his voice trembling with fear. "Was that you, Charlotte?" Charlotte shook her head, unable to speak. She couldn't explain what had just happened. The book, the room, everything felt wrong. The house was trying to communicate with them, but it wasn't speaking in a way they could understand. "We need to leave," she finally managed to say, her voice shaking. But as they turned to leave, the door slammed shut behind them, trapping them inside. The group stumbled back from the door, their hearts pounding with fear as they looked around the room. The walls felt too close now, as though the very space itself was shifting in ways they couldn't fully comprehend. The house was playing games with them, games with time, games with reality. The lights, flickering and dimming, seemed to mock their every movement, as if the mansion was responding to their every fear, feeding off it. "What the hell was that?" Sarah asked, her voice tight with terror. "The book, the voices, everything. It's all wrong." Charlotte, still shaking, couldn't bring herself to answer immediately. Her mind raced, trying to piece together what had just happened. The book, the one that seemed to call to her, pulling her closer, almost beckoning her to uncover its secrets, had felt alive in her hands. And the voice, the words echoing in her mind, were not something she could ignore. They weren't meant. For her, Yet she had heard them loud and clear. Time is not your ally. You are already too far gone. She had heard the words clearly, but what did they mean? Had they been spoken by the house itself, or had the mansion planted them in her mind? She shook her head, trying to clear the fog, but the pressure in the air seemed to grow heavier. Charlotte? Claire's voice broke through her thoughts, softer now, more concerned. What's happening? The other friends were standing just behind her, their faces filled with a mixture of fear and confusion. They too had felt the shift in the air, the sudden chill that had followed them into the room. The energy in the mansion had changed again, shifted, as though the house had opened another door into something darker, more sinister. "We need to get out of here," Matt said, his voice strained with panic. "This place, it's messing with us. It's like it wants us to go crazy." Charlotte nodded, but didn't speak. The house had already begun to invade their minds, twisting their perception of reality, and now the mansion was watching them more closely than ever. They turned to leave, but when they reached the door, something strange happened. The door, which had slammed shut behind them only moments before, was now wide open. The hallway beyond was shrouded in shadow, darker than it had been when they entered the room. The coldness from the storm outside had crept into the mansion, and now it seemed to be filling every inch of the house, seeping into their bones. The house was alive, breathing in a way that was unnatural. And now, it had become more aggressive, its grip tightening with every passing second. The clock in the hallway was ticking again, its second hand moving slowly, too slowly, almost as though it were dragging through the minutes. But when Charlotte glanced up at it, her blood froze. The clock, which had been stuck at 12 when they first arrived, had begun to tick, but it wasn't ticking forward. The second hand was moving, backward. The group stood frozen in the hallway, their eyes fixed on the clock. The reality of what they were seeing hit them like a wave, crashing over them in a cold, suffocating tide. What the hell is going on?" James whispered, his voice barely audible. Charlotte couldn't take her eyes off the clock. She could feel the house closing in on them, its ancient walls holding them captive as it played its cruel game. "This isn't possible," she whispered to herself. "Time doesn't work like this. It can't work like this." But the clock continued to move in reverse. The second hand ticked backward, each movement slower than the last, as though time itself was unraveling, stretching out and folding in on itself. The minutes disappeared into hours, hours into days, and the house seemed to stretch out in all directions. A low hum began to fill the air, growing louder with each passing moment, vibrating through the walls of the mansion. It was a sound that felt like it was coming from deep within the house, from some ancient, forgotten part of it, a place where the laws of time no longer applied. "Listen," Charlotte said, her voice tight. "The house, it's not just trapping us, it's rewriting time." She turned away from the clock and looked toward the others, her eyes wide with realization. "We're not in the world we know anymore. This isn't just some haunted house. It's something else. Something beyond that." "What do you mean?" Claire asked, her voice trembling with fear. "I mean, I don't think time is even moving forward here. It's been frozen, and now it's being undone," Charlotte said, her words tumbling out as the truth began to sink in. "The mansion is manipulating us. The clock isn't just showing us the time, it's rewriting it." The group stood still in shock, unable to comprehend what Charlotte had just said. The air felt thick with an unseen force, and the mansion groaned under the weight of the strange events unfolding. The second hand on the clock continued its erratic movement, its backward motion seeming to mock the very idea of time itself. "I think we need to get out of here," Sarah said, her voice shaky. "We need to leave now." But even as she spoke, they realized the house had other plans. The walls seemed to close in, and the temperature dropped once again, colder than before. The air grew thick with the scent of decay, and the house itself seemed to sigh in response, as though it were drawing in a deep breath before something even worse happened. The group stood, frozen, unsure of what to do, their eyes darting around the room, searching for any way out. But the house was alive now, and it had no intention of letting them go. The footsteps began again. This time they were louder, more distinct. The sound echoed through the hallways, growing closer, and the group instinctively backed away from the sound, each of them trying to make sense of the eerie situation. The footsteps, slow, deliberate, almost calculated, sounded like they were coming from behind the walls themselves, as if the house had taken on a life of its own. "We're not alone," Matt said, his voice barely above a whisper. "This place, it's not just haunted, it's alive." Charlotte felt a chill run down her spine as she listened to the footsteps draw closer. They were coming for them. No, they were already here. Suddenly, the door at the end of the hallway slammed open with a violent bang, and the group froze, too terrified to move. The figure standing in the doorway was shadowy, its features indistinct, but there was no mistaking the malevolent presence behind it. The figure seemed to flicker in and out of existence, like an image too faint to fully grasp. Who are you?" Claire whispered, her voice trembling. She took a step back, but the figure didn't move. Instead, a low, cold laugh echoed through the house, the sound filling the room and the walls like an unspoken truth. The laughter was not human. It was something older, something that had been waiting in the mansion for centuries, feeding on the memories, on the fear of those who dared to enter. "You are not the first to be trapped here," the figure said, its voice low and gravelly, as though it was speaking through the very walls themselves. The group stood frozen, the house holding them in its grip as the figure moved closer. Each step it took seemed to echo through the hallway, its presence growing stronger, darker. "You have broken the rules of the house," it continued, its voice growing colder. "Now you will pay the price." The group felt the air grow heavier, the pressure building around them like an unseen force. The temperature dropped even further, and they could see their breath, their bodies shivering in the unnatural cold. The walls groaned again, and the sound of the footsteps grew louder, coming from all directions, from everywhere and nowhere at once. Charlotte's heart pounded in her chest as she stepped forward, determination flooding through her. "We're not staying here. We're leaving, whether you like it or not." But as soon as the words left her mouth, the figure stepped forward, its shadow stretching impossibly long, and the house seemed to scream in protest. The walls shook violently, and the lights flickered once again, casting erratic shadows across the room. "Time is not your ally," the figure repeated, its voice rising in intensity. "It will never be your ally." And with that, the mansion seemed to exhale, a deafening roar filling the air as the world around them twisted and warped once again. The walls of the mansion groaned under the weight of something ancient, as if the house itself were alive, breathing with each passing moment. The shadows seemed to twist and stretch unnaturally, moving with a life of their own, mimicking the movements of the group drawing closer, hungry for their fear. The air had turned thick, cloying, and the temperature had dropped to a near unbearable chill. The group, still huddled together in the dimly lit hallway, could feel the presence of the house pressing in on them, tightening its grip. Charlotte's hand shook as she reached for the doorknob of the hallway door, the same one they had tried to open moments before. The unseen force that seemed to pulse through the mansion wasn't giving them any respite. The house's power was growing, as if it were feeding on their terror, strengthening with every second they spent inside. It was no longer a house. It was a prison, a labyrinth with no way out. As she twisted the knob, the door creaked open, revealing the darkened room beyond. The others stood close behind her, their breath shallow, uncertain as they entered. The air inside the room felt even colder than the hallway, and the shadows seemed to cling to the corners, thickening like ink. "We need to find a way out of here," Alex said, his voice hushed, filled with an underlying urgency. "The house. It's not just trapping us in time, it's taking us piece by piece. Look at the clock, it's moving backward, for God's sake. We can't just stand around and wait for whatever's next." Charlotte turned her gaze to the far side of the room. It was familiar, too familiar. The furniture was old and worn, just like the rest of the house, but the eerie stillness of the room made it feel more like a tomb than a living space. The desk in the corner had papers strewn across it, and in the farthest corner, a mirror reflected back nothing but the shadows that seemed to shift even there. But it wasn't the room that had drawn her attention. It was the sound. The faintest whisper seemed to echo from the walls, like a memory trying to claw its way into the present. Her skin crawled as she moved toward the desk, pushing aside the papers, searching for something, anything, that could explain the madness they were trapped in. "Charlotte, wait." Matt's voice cut through the silence, filled with concern. She turned, and it was then that she noticed it. Sarah was gone. One moment she had been standing beside them, her hand gripping the back of a chair. The next, she was simply gone. There was no trace of her, no sign of movement, no indication that she had even been there at all. The empty space where she had been felt colder, darker, as if her very presence had been erased from existence. "What? Where did she go?" James asked, his voice tight, a tremor of panic rising in his chest. Charlotte's eyes scanned the room frantically, looking for any clue. The air around them seemed to thicken, and the shadows in the corners seemed to creep closer, closing in like an encroaching fog. "We have to find her," Claire said, stepping forward, her face pale, her voice shaking with anxiety. "She couldn't have just vanished. This place, it's doing something to us." "It's more than that," Charlotte whispered, her voice strained with the realization. "The house is erasing us. It's erasing her." The others stood in stunned silence, the reality of what Charlotte was saying slowly sinking in. Sarah, one of them, had just disappeared, as though she had never existed at all. There was no trace of her, no footprints, no sounds of her calling for help. She was just gone. The whispers returned, this time louder, clearer. They seemed to seep from the very walls themselves, echoing around the room, filling their minds with words they could not understand, words that made their skin crawl. "You cannot escape. The house will take all of you. Time is lost. You are lost." Charlotte's heart pounded in her chest. She turned quickly, her eyes scanning the room once again. "We have to get out. We have to find her," she urged, her voice shaking, with a growing sense of urgency. But as she stepped forward, a cold wind swept through the room, slamming the door shut behind them. The sound of the latch clicking into place was deafening in the silence, and a feeling of suffocating dread filled the space. "What's happening?" Matt asked, his voice barely above a whisper. "I don't know," Charlotte replied, swallowing hard. "But I know we're running out of time." She stepped back toward the door, reaching for the handle, but before she could touch it, the room seemed to distort. The walls wavered in her vision, bending and twisting as though they were made of liquid. The shadows began to take on shapes, flickering like shadows of people, moving like they had a life of their own. The air felt thick, almost alive, and the space around them seemed to shift in impossible ways. Suddenly, a sharp, piercing scream echoed through the house. It was Sarah's voice. The group froze, the blood draining from their faces. It was distant, muffled, but unmistakable. The scream came again, louder this time, filled with pure terror. Without thinking, Charlotte grabbed the handle and yanked the door open. The hallway outside was no longer the same. The mansion's once familiar layout had warped. The walls now stretched out, farther than they should have been, like the hallway was extending, pulling them deeper into the maze. The house was shifting, bending the very fabric of reality to trap them inside. The group rushed down the hall, following the sound of Sarah's scream. They passed door after door, each one a reflection of the last, identical rooms with dark corners, empty shelves, and vacant spaces. The house was playing with them, leading them deeper into its labyrinthine depths. And then they found her. Sarah's body was lying in the center of a room that hadn't been there before. Her eyes were wide open, but there was no recognition in them. The air around her was cold, colder than anything they had felt before. The group approached cautiously, unsure of what they would find, but when they reached her, something wasn't right. Her body was there, but it felt wrong. She looked like Sarah, but there was a blankness in her eyes, a hollow emptiness that wasn't there before. Her mouth was slightly open, but no words came from her lips. "Sarah," Charlotte called softly, kneeling beside her. The figure stirred, its eyes flickering for a moment before they focused on Charlotte. But they weren't Sarah's eyes. They were darker, older, and filled with something that made Charlotte's heart skip a beat. "She's gone," the figure whispered, its voice not Sarah's, but something else, something ancient. "You cannot save her." The voice sent a chill down Charlotte's spine, and she recoiled, standing up quickly. The others backed away too, their faces pale with fear. "What? What is this?" Alex asked, his voice quivering. The figure, Sarah, rose from the floor, her movements jerky, unnatural. She began to speak again, but the words were not hers. The voice that came from her mouth was deeper, colder, as though something ancient was speaking through her. "The house calls for you. You are part of it now, all of you." The shadows in the room seemed to grow darker, thicker. The walls began to pulse, as if the very heart of the mansion was beating in time with the group's growing panic. Time, too, seemed to bend and stretch, twisting their sense of reality. "No!" Charlotte shouted, trying to back away. But the figure, Sarah, lunged at her, her hands outstretched. The room seemed to spin, and just as Charlotte was about to turn and run, the figure collapsed to the ground. Sarah's body crumpled in on itself, falling into a heap on the cold floor. The room went silent, the air heavy with the remnants of whatever had just transpired. For a moment, the group stood in stunned silence, unsure of what they had just witnessed. But the silence was short-lived. The walls trembled again, and the clock on the far wall, which had been moving backward, suddenly stopped. "Dead. She's gone," Charlotte whispered, her voice barely audible. And that's when they realized it. The house had taken Sarah, and it wasn't done yet. The house was alive. Charlotte's breath was shallow as she stared at the lifeless form of Sarah, her mind reeling. For a moment, the world felt suspended. Everything around her blurred into a thick fog, and the air seemed to grow heavier. The shadows in the room no longer clung to the corners but surged forward, creeping like dark fingers against the walls, as if they were trying to consume her, to drag her into the darkness with them. The others stood in a silent, stunned circle around. Sarah's body, their faces pale, their eyes wide with terror. They could feel it now, the malevolent presence of the house, pressing in on them, growing stronger with every passing second. They weren't just trapped within its walls, they were part of it. The mansion had claimed them one by one, and now it was taking its toll. "We need to leave," Claire whispered, her voice trembling. She took a step back, looking around the room, as if expecting the walls to close in on her. Now, but even as she spoke, Charlotte could feel the temperature in the room drop further, colder than it had ever been before. The cold seeped into her bones, wrapping around her heart, and she knew with a certainty so deep it chilled her to the core that they weren't getting out. Not easily. Not without facing whatever it was that had taken Sarah. This place, Matt said, his voice strained, as he stepped away from the crumpled body of their friend. This place isn't just haunted, it's alive. It's controlling everything. Charlotte's gaze drifted to the clock on the wall, its second hand still stuck, frozen at 12. Time had stopped, completely. But even as the clock remained suspended in its unnatural stasis, the walls around them seemed to pulse with a terrible rhythm, a heartbeat that echoed through the very foundation of the house. "We can't escape," Alex murmured, his eyes wide with growing terror. "Not unless we figure out how to stop it, but how?" The house was watching them. Charlotte could feel it, could sense the house's awareness, like an all-seeing presence that moved behind the walls, beneath the floorboards, and through the very air they breathed. It was waiting, watching, and it would take them one by one until there was no one left. She couldn't let that happen. She wouldn't. "Think," she said, her voice trembling but resolute. "We need to think. There has to be a way to break this. We have to find Sarah. We have to find a way to stop it." The group remained silent, their minds racing for answers that seemed to slip further and further away with every passing moment. But then, a sudden sound broke the stillness, the unmistakable sound of something heavy moving across the floor. A dragging sound, slow and deliberate. Charlotte's eyes widened in horror. She turned to the others. But before they could react, the source of the sound revealed itself. A figure emerged from the shadows. It was Sarah, but it wasn't Sarah. The thing that crawled into view was no longer their friend. Her body was twisted, grotesque, her eyes wide open but unseeing, glazed with a dark, unnatural light. Her skin was pale, sickly, and her movements were jerky, as though she was being controlled by invisible strings. Her mouth hung open in a grotesque imitation of a smile, and her hands, once warm and familiar, were now twisted, like gnarled branches reaching out for them. "No," Claire gasped, stepping back. "This isn't Sarah. This isn't her." The thing, Sarah, stopped moving when it reached the center of the room. It stood there, motionless, staring at them with those lifeless eyes. Then, slowly, it tilted its head to the side, its mouth opening wider, a low, guttural sound escaping from deep within its throat. "You cannot escape." The voice was hers, but it was wrong, distorted, hollow. It was as though the house itself had taken over her voice, shaping it, twisting it into something unnatural. The figure took a step forward, its limbs jerking unnaturally, and the air grew colder with every inch it moved. "We need to run," Matt said, his voice cracking with fear. "Now!" But before anyone could move, the house responded. The walls trembled, the lights flickering, and a deep rumble like the earth itself was shaking filled the room. The door slammed shut, trapping them inside. "No!" Alex shouted, running toward the door, slamming his hands against it in desperation. "Let us out." But there was no escape. The house had claimed them. They were trapped in its web, and it wasn't going to let them go. Not without taking something from them first. Charlotte turned to face the others, her heart pounding in her chest. "We have to stop this. We have to find the source. It's controlling us, controlling time. If we don't figure this out, Sarah's just the beginning." The shadows around them seemed to grow darker, more oppressive, as if the mansion itself were listening. And in that darkness, something else stirred, a presence more ancient than anything they had encountered before. "You cannot stop what has already begun," the voice of Sarah. No, the thing that had once been Sarah, whispered, its voice echoing in their minds. "You are part of this now. and there is no escape. The floor beneath them groaned as if the house itself was shifting, moving, preparing to consume them. The temperature dropped even further, and they could see their breath in the air, their hands trembling in the icy cold. "We have to find the heart of the house," Charlotte said, her voice firm, though it quivered with fear. "The source. If we don't, it will take us all." But just as she spoke those words, the walls seemed to close in. The room warped, bending unnaturally, the shadows around them thickening like a storm cloud that threatened to swallow them whole. The air grew heavier with every breath they took, and the house seemed to hum in response. It wasn't just a building, it was something more. A force, an entity that had been alive for centuries, feeding off the souls that wandered into its depths. The figure of Sarah, still standing motionless in the center of the room, suddenly jerked, her body contorting in unnatural angles. Her mouth opened wide, wider than humanly possible, and the room was filled with a deafening sound, a scream that echoed through the very foundations of the mansion. But the scream was not just Sarah's. It was the house itself. The mansion was alive, and it was hungry. The figure collapsed to the floor with a sickening thud, and the silence that followed was suffocating. The group stood frozen, unsure of what to do next. The air was thick with the smell of decay, and the walls around them seemed to press in closer, the darkness swallowing everything it touched. Charlotte turned to the others, her eyes wide with terror. "We need to get to the heart of the house, now, before it's too late." But the house had already begun to move. It was no longer just a building. It was an entity, a living, breathing thing that fed on fear, on time, on the very essence of those trapped inside, and it would not let them go. The house was no longer a place of refuge. It had become an omnipresent force, a living entity that pulsed with a dark rhythm, a heartbeat that seemed to echo through every crack in the walls and floorboards. The cold was unbearable now, seeping into their bones, suffocating them with each breath. Every corner of the mansion felt like it was closing in on them, pushing them further into the claustrophobic depths of the nightmare they had unwittingly stepped into. "Charlotte," Matt's voice cut through the heavy silence, his tone filled with panic. "What are we supposed to do? We can't even leave. We can't even run. What if we're already too late?" Charlotte's eyes were fixed on the doorway ahead. The others were gathered around her, their faces pale and tense, the weight of what had happened to Sarah still hanging heavily in the air. But they had no time to mourn. Not yet. The house had already taken one of them, and as much as they tried to ignore it, they knew they were next. "We don't have a choice," she said, her voice firm but strained with the pressure of their situation. "We have to get to the heart of the house. If we can destroy it, if we can break whatever holds this place together, we might have a chance to escape." "But how do you even know where it is?" Alex asked, his voice shaking slightly, the panic evident in his eyes. "How do we even know we're not walking into our graves?" Charlotte hesitated for a moment. Her mind raced, desperately trying to recall any clue they had come across in the mansion. The house wasn't just alive. It had a history, a presence that stretched back centuries, feeding on the souls that entered its walls. And somewhere deep, within its labyrinthine corridors, the heart of the house pulsed, the source of its power. "I don't know," she admitted, her voice heavy with the weight of uncertainty. "But we have to try." The air around them seemed to vibrate, thick with the unseen force that had consumed the mansion. The floorboards beneath their feet creaked ominously, the shadows in the corners of the room shifting like living things. The walls seemed to groan, as if the house itself were reacting to their every movement, pulling them deeper into its depths. "Let's go," Claire said, her voice small but resolute. "We don't have much time." The group moved forward, each step a calculated risk. The mansion felt different now, Its once grand halls and ornate rooms were now twisted, distorted. Every door they opened led them into a room they had never seen before. The rooms shifted, changed, as though the house itself was reshaping to prevent them from finding the heart of its power. Each corner, each hallway, led them deeper into a maze of darkness and confusion. The house was playing with them, testing them, drawing them closer to its core. They moved through the winding corridors, the flickering lights casting eerie shadows that seemed to move with them. The mansion was vast, too vast, and every time they thought they had found a way out, another passage would open, pulling them further into its heart. The walls seemed to close in on them, the air growing thick and suffocating, the very fabric of reality bending under the weight of the mansion's ancient power. "This place is like a maze," James muttered, his voice tight with frustration. "No matter where we go, it's the same, over and over, the same rooms, the same hallways. It's all endless. We're not just walking through rooms," Charlotte said, her voice distant, almost detached. "The house is alive. It's warping reality, trying to keep us from getting to the heart." "But we have to keep going," Claire said, her voice shaking. "If we stop, we'll never get out." Suddenly, a low hum filled the air, rising from the depths of the house. It was a sound that reverberated through their bodies, a deep vibration that seemed to come from the very core of the mansion. The walls began to pulse, the rhythm of the hum matching the beating of a heart. It was the heart of the house, and they were getting closer. Charlotte's heart hammered in her chest as the hum grew louder, more insistent. The house was waking up, becoming more aware of their presence. It was no longer content to merely trap them. It was hunting them. They turned a corner, and before them stood a massive set of double doors. The walls around them seemed to shift and warp, like the mansion itself was preparing for something, a final confrontation. The doors were old, covered in dark, intricate carvings, symbols that seemed to shift and change as they gazed upon them, as though the house was alive, reacting to their presence. "This is it," Charlotte said, her voice steady but filled with anticipation. "The heart of the house." She reached for the door, her hand trembling as she grasped the cold handle. The moment she touched it, a jolt of energy shot through her, a rush of power so intense it nearly knocked her off her feet. The house roared in response, its power pulsing through the walls, shaking the foundation beneath them. The doors groaned, their hinges creaking as if they had not been opened in centuries. Charlotte forced the doors open, and as they creaked wide, a blinding light poured out from the crack, illuminating the dark hallway behind them. The air grew thick with an unnatural heat, and the smell of decay filled their noses. The heart of the house was not what they had expected. It was not a room, not a chamber, but an abyss. The center of the mansion was a vast, dark pit, its walls lined with twisted roots and vines that pulsed with life. The ground beneath their feet seemed to tremble, and the air hummed with the oppressive weight of power. The pit stretched downward, deeper than they could see, its depths filled with darkness and the echo of something ancient. From the depths of the pit, a low voice echoed, a voice that was not human. It was the voice of the house itself. "You are too late." The voice reverberated through their bodies, sending waves of terror crashing over them. The house had been feeding on their fear, on their very souls, and now it was preparing to take them. The mansion was more than a building. It was a creature, an entity that had existed long before their time, feeding on the life force of those who entered its walls. The group stood frozen, their eyes wide with terror, as the darkness into the pit began to stir. Shadows twisted and writhed, forming shapes that resembled the faces of those who had come before them. Faces of souls trapped in the mansion, their bodies twisted and contorted, their eyes wide with the same fear that now gripped the group. They're all... Matt's voice trailed off, his eyes wide with disbelief. They're all still here. Charlotte stepped forward, her heart racing. We have to destroy it. We have to destroy the heart of the house. But the house was not going to make it easy. The ground beneath their feet began to shake violently, and the air was filled with a deep, guttural growl. The walls of the pit seemed to close in, and the roots and vines began to thrash violently, lashing out like tendrils of some great beast. You cannot destroy me. The voice echoed again, growing louder, more powerful. I am the heart of the house. I am eternal. You are mine. The shadows around them seemed to close in, and the group staggered backward, fear taking hold of them. The walls seemed to pulse, alive with a dark energy, and the pit in front of them seemed to grow deeper, darker, as though it were pulling them in. Charlotte's mind raced, searching for a way to fight back. There had to be something in the mansion's history, something in the ritual of the house that could stop it. The symbols, the carvings, they were a clue. Look, Charlotte shouted, pointing to the wall above the pit. The symbols. They're the key. The group turned toward the carvings, and as they focused on them, the symbols began to glow with an eerie light. The house seemed to react, the air growing heavier, the shadows thicker. But Charlotte felt a flicker of hope. The house had a weakness. It had to. She stepped forward, her voice steady as she recited the words inscribed in the carvings, words she could not understand but somehow knew. The moment she spoke them, the pit trembled, and the heart of the house began to writhe in agony. No. The voice of the house screamed, a cacophony of rage and fear. You cannot stop me! But it was too late. The mansion screamed as its heart began to crumble, the power that had held it together unraveling. The walls shook violently, the roots and vines retracting into the darkness, and for a brief moment, the house seemed to collapse, in on itself. The light from the pit grew brighter, and the shadows began to retreat, fading into nothing. And then, the silence. The walls of the mansion groaned as if in agony, its foundation trembling beneath their feet. The house had been shaken to its core, its heart, once pulsating with malevolent energy, now crumbling, unraveling, as the group stood at its threshold. Charlotte's breath came in short, ragged gasps, her heart pounding in her chest, a dull ache settling in her bones. The mansion was alive, but now it was dying. But they were not out of danger yet. The shadows that had once clung to the corners of the room now swirled like dark smoke, coiling and twisting in the air above them. The mansion's heartbeat had slowed, but the remnants of its power still clung to the walls, pulsing with a malevolent energy. The air was thick with an unsettling tension, as if something terrible, was waiting for them to make their next move. I thought we'd won, Matt said, his voice trembling with exhaustion, his eyes darting nervously around the room. Why is it still moving? It's not over, Charlotte replied, her voice steady but filled with uncertainty. The house, the entity, it's not dead yet. It's weakening, but it's still holding on to something. Claire glanced at the door behind them, the one they had just entered through. It's like the house is fighting back, she said, trying to pull us back in. Charlotte nodded, feeling the weight of the mansion's presence pressing down on her. She could feel the air vibrating with the intensity of the house's rage, like an electrical current that ran through the walls, thrumming beneath her feet. The mansion was responding to the destruction of its heart, but instead of crumbling, it seemed to be fighting for survival, its walls tightening, its grip on them growing stronger. I don't think we're done yet, she said, her voice grim. We need to finish what we started. The heart. It's still here. The house might be dying, but its will isn't. The shadows thickened around them, curling like tendrils, reaching out for them. Charlotte could hear the whispers again. the low, guttural voices that had plagued them from the very beginning. These voices were no longer distant. They were closer now, louder, as though they were circling around them inside their heads, pressing against their minds. "You are mine," the voices hissed. "You cannot escape." The temperature dropped again, a bone-chilling cold that wrapped around them, freezing their limbs, numbing their fingers. They could see their breath in the air, white puffs against the darkness, their hearts racing with the primal fear that had gripped them since the moment they entered the mansion. "We need to destroy it," Charlotte said again, more urgently this time. "But we have to find the true source of its power. If we don't..." Her voice trailed off as she turned to face the others. They were all standing frozen, their eyes wide with terror. But they knew what she meant. They were running out of time. The house was alive, and as long as its heart still beat, they were trapped in its grip. "Where do we even look?" Alex asked, his voice hoarse. "We've been everywhere. We've seen everything, and it's all the same. It's like we're stuck." Charlotte felt a pang of fear in her chest. He was right. The house was an endless maze, and they had been trapped within its walls for what felt like an eternity. But there had to be something they were missing, something they hadn't discovered yet. Her eyes flickered back to the pit in the center of the room, where the remnants of the mansion's heart had once pulsed with dark energy. She remembered the symbols they had seen earlier, the carvings on the walls. There had been something there, something they had missed. Her mind raced, and then it hit her. The symbols, the language of the house, the ancient script that had been carved into the walls had been more than just decoration. It was a language of power, of ritual. The house had been built on the blood of the innocent, and those symbols had been the key to its strength. Charlotte moved quickly, her feet barely touching the floor as she made her way toward the carvings on the wall. The others followed her, their footsteps echoing in the silence of the room, their eyes wide with fear and uncertainty. "These symbols," Charlotte muttered, her fingers brushing over the jagged edges of the carvings. "They're not just markings. They're a map, a guide. This is where it all started." She traced the symbols with her fingers, feeling the heat that radiated from them. The air around them shifted again, the house groaning in response to her touch. The walls seemed to close in on them, but Charlotte refused to move. She had to finish this. They had to finish this. "Charlotte, what are you doing?" Claire asked, her voice filled with desperation. "We don't have much time. We need to get out of here." "No," Charlotte said, her voice firm. "We need to destroy the source. The house is alive, but it's also a trap. It's built on this, on these symbols. It's been feeding off us this entire time. If we can break the connection, we can destroy it." She took a deep breath, gathering every ounce of strength she had left. The air seemed to pulse with power, and she could feel the mansion's heartbeat growing louder, faster. It was like the house knew what they were trying to do. It was resisting them, but Charlotte didn't falter. "Help me," she said to the others. "We have to finish this, together." They moved forward, each of them standing beside her as she began to speak the words that had been etched into the walls. The language of the house, ancient and dark, flowed from her lips, the words resonating with power that seemed to reverberate through the air. As she spoke, the mansion trembled, the ground beneath them shaking violently. The shadows around them swirled, the darkness growing thicker, as if it were alive, trying to snuff out their light. "You are mine," the voice came again, but this time it wasn't just in their heads. It was everywhere, filling the room, seeping from the walls, the floor, the very air. The house had become a living, breathing thing, and it was angry. But Charlotte kept speaking, her voice steady as the others joined in. Together they recited the words, their voices rising in unison, louder than the darkness that surrounded them. The mansion groaned, the walls trembling, as if the house were trying to fight back. But it couldn't. The words they spoke had power. The power to break the house's hold on them. And then, with a deafening crack, the house screamed. The ground shook beneath their feet, and the walls seemed to bend and twist as if they were being torn apart. The air grew heavy, thick with energy as the house roared in fury. But Charlotte didn't stop. She couldn't. They were so close. With one final word, the mansion collapsed. The walls cracked, the shadows retreated, and the oppressive weight of the house lifted from their shoulders. The mansion trembled one last time, its walls groaning and cracking, as though it were being torn from the inside out. The very foundation of the house seemed to crumble, and then, with a sound like thunder, the mansion exploded in a burst of light. And just like that, it was over. The group stood in stunned silence, their bodies trembling from the weight of what had just happened. The house was gone, its power shattered, its grip on them broken. They were free. But as the dust settled and the air cleared, Charlotte couldn't shake the feeling that something had been left behind. The ground beneath them trembled one last time, a final tremor that reverberated through the air like the last pulse of a dying heart. Charlotte's hands shook as she steadied herself against the remains of what had once been the mansion's grand entrance hall. The air felt different now. Lighter, somehow. The oppressive weight that had hung over them for so long was gone, replaced by an eerie, suffocating stillness that filled the space. The house was no more. But as the dust settled and the echoes of the explosion began to fade, a quiet dread settled into Charlotte's chest. The same feeling she had felt when she first entered this cursed place. The silence was unnerving. Her eyes scanned the wreckage, broken walls, shattered windows, the remnants of what had once been a grand and foreboding structure. Now all that remained was a skeletal shell. The house had collapsed in on itself, its foundation crumbling to dust. The mansion that had once seemed invincible, alive with dark energy, was now reduced to ruins. But still, something felt off. A prickling sensation crawled down her spine, the hairs on the back of her neck standing on end. She glanced at the others, their faces just as pale, their expressions a mix of exhaustion and disbelief. "We did it," Alex said, his voice raw, hoarse from the intensity of their ordeal. "It's over. We're free." Charlotte nodded, but her mind was not at ease. Her gaze drifted to the horizon, where the storm clouds, which had once covered the sky, were now parting, revealing the first light of dawn breaking through the darkness. The wind had died down, and the air felt crisp, as though the world itself was trying to breathe again after being suffocated. But despite the calm, a question lingered in Charlotte's mind. They had escaped, yes, but had they truly broken the curse? Was the house truly gone? "We need to go," Claire said, her voice shaky but resolute. "We need to get out of here before whatever remains of this place catches up with us." Charlotte turned to her, nodding in agreement. "Right, let's get out of here." The group moved toward the ruins of the mansion's once grand entrance, their steps slow and heavy as the weight of their ordeal began to settle in. They had survived the worst, but they were far from unscathed. The emotional and psychological toll was evident in their eyes, in the way they moved, as though they were still trapped in some lingering nightmare. The wreckage of the mansion was a jagged, broken reminder of everything they had been through. Yet, as they neared the door, the final threshold that separated them from the horrors they had faced, the oppressive weight of the house seemed to lift, as if the air around them were finally beginning to breathe again. They stepped outside, blinking as their eyes adjusted to the light of day. The landscape before them was quiet, peaceful, as if nothing had ever happened. The wind rustled the leaves of the trees, birds chirped in the distance, and the sky above was clear, a pale blue expanse that seemed to offer a world beyond the nightmare they had just left behind. For a moment, they just stood there, staring out at the world that had been waiting for them. The weight in their chests, the pounding of their hearts, had subsided, replaced by the relief that they were finally free. "We made it," Matt said, a weak smile forming on his lips. "We actually made it." Charlotte stood at the edge of the property, her gaze still fixed on the distant horizon. She felt the warmth of the sun on her skin, but there was a lingering unease in her gut, a sense of foreboding that she couldn't shake. It was over. The mansion was destroyed. The heart had been shattered. And yet, something wasn't right. "We need to keep moving," she said, turning back to the others, her voice quieter now. I feel like we're not done yet." They exchanged uncertain looks, but none of them argued. They had all felt it, the tug, the strange weight that still clung to them. It was as if the house had left a mark on them, a scar that wouldn't heal no matter how far they went. "I don't know, Charlotte," Alex said, his voice uncertain. "You saw it too, right? The house is gone. We won." But Charlotte could still feel it, deep in her chest. The mansion had been destroyed, yes, but its influence hadn't left them. Not entirely. It had left a piece of itself inside them, a shadow that clung to the edges of their thoughts, an echo that refused to be silenced. "I know," Charlotte said softly, "but I can't shake the feeling that something's still here. We need to keep moving." And so, they began to walk, unsure of where they were going, but certain that they needed to leave the ruins behind. Their steps were slow, hesitant at first, but as they moved away from the mansion, the unease began to lift. The further they walked, the more they began to feel the weight of the nightmare lifting, as though they were finally breaking free from its grip. But as they reached the edge of the property, just beyond the shattered remains of the mansion's once grand entrance, something caught Charlotte's eye. A figure. At first she thought it was a trick of the light, a fleeting image in the corner of her vision. But as she looked closer, the figure became clearer, a silhouette standing just beyond the edge of the trees, a figure that seemed strangely familiar. "Sarah," Charlotte whispered, her heart skipping a beat. The others froze, their eyes following her gaze. But when they turned to look, the figure was gone, vanished into the mist. Charlotte's breath caught in her throat. "Did you see that?" "See what?" Claire asked, her voice tight with fear. "That figure. It was Sarah." "I know it was." But they had all seen Sarah vanish, her body consumed by the house, transformed into something else entirely. There was no way she could be standing out there, watching them from the trees. "Charlotte, it's not her," Matt said, his voice calm but firm. "We've been through hell. You're seeing things. We all are." But Charlotte couldn't shake the feeling, the haunting sense that the house wasn't done with them yet, that no matter how far they walked, no matter how far they ran, the darkness of the mansion would follow them. The wind picked up again, rustling the trees and carrying with it an eerie whisper. It was almost imperceptible, but Charlotte swore she heard it, just beneath the sound of the wind. "You can't escape." Her heart skipped a beat, and she turned to face the others, her eyes wide with fear. "We need to go back. We can't outrun it." The others exchanged uneasy glances, but Charlotte could see the doubt in their eyes. They wanted to believe it was over. They wanted to believe they had escaped. But deep down, they all knew the truth. The house was still with them. It had left a mark on their souls, an imprint that could never be erased. It was still there, lurking just beneath the surface, and as they turned back toward the ruins, the wind whispered again, louder this time, as if the mansion itself was calling to them. "You will never be free. You're deep into the story now, and the horrors are only escalating. If you're still with us, don't forget to like and subscribe. Tell us where you're listening from in the comments. Who else is staying up late to face this nightmare? Settle in. The terror continues. The world outside the mansion was unrecognizable. The trees that once lined the long drive were now twisted and gnarled, their limbs reaching toward the sky like dark skeletal hands. The sun was barely breaking through the clouds, its light filtered through an unnatural haze. The air was thick, heavy with an oppressive silence that hung like a shroud over everything. Charlotte moved with purpose, her steps steady, but filled with a sense of dread that she couldn't shake. The mansion had fallen, its heart had been destroyed, but the house had left its mark on them, and now it felt as though the world outside was just as suffocating, as if the echoes of the past were following them, chasing them down. "We need to keep moving," Charlotte said, her voice low, almost to herself. "We can't stop, not yet." The others were close behind her, their faces pale, their eyes distant. The relief of escaping the mansion was long gone, replaced by a sense of unease, a gnawing fear that had taken root in the pit of their stomachs. "We've been walking for hours," Claire said, her voice weary, yet filled with anxiety. "We need to rest." "No," Charlotte said, her voice sharper than she intended. "We can't rest. We're not free yet." She didn't know how she knew it, but she could feel it. The pull of the house, lingering just beyond the edge of their perception. The house was not done with them. It couldn't be. They had been marked, and no matter how far they walked, no matter how far they ran, it would follow. "I think she's right," Alex said, his voice filled with uncertainty. "I still feel it, like we're being watched." "Do you feel it too?" Matt asked, his voice low, strained. "It's like we're still in the house. It's like the mansion hasn't let go of us." Charlotte nodded, her gaze distant. "It's not over. Not yet." They pressed on in silence, the ground beneath them uneven, the path ahead shrouded in mist. The world around them seemed to close in, the trees bending toward them like silent, observing sentinels. The further they walked, the more the air seemed to thicken, the more it felt like the house's shadow was looming just behind them, pressing in on their every move. They walked for what felt like hours, the landscape shifting subtly, the world around them becoming more and more distorted. The road beneath their feet twisted, curling back on itself like the house's labyrinthine halls. The trees around them began to take on unnatural shapes, branches that twisted into forms too perfect, too symmetrical, like something carved by an unseen hand. "This isn't right," Claire said, her voice trembling. "We've passed this tree before, this exact one." Charlotte looked ahead, and sure enough, the tree they had passed just moments ago was standing before them again, its dark limbs stretching high above their heads. The sense of déjà vu gripped her, a chilling realization seeping into her bones. "Be cool. House is still playing with us," Charlotte said quietly. "It's still here. We can't outrun it." A low rumbling sound echoed from deep within the forest. The trees seemed to shudder, the ground beneath their feet vibrating as though something deep within the earth was waking up. The sound grew louder, a distant, rhythmic thumping that mimicked the heartbeat of the mansion itself. The whispers returned. They started as soft murmurs at the edge of their hearing, almost imperceptible, like a wind brushing against their ears. But soon, they grew louder, clearer. The words were distorted like voices trapped underwater, echoing in the hollow chambers of their minds. "You cannot escape. We are always watching. You belong to us." The voices were no longer just echoes in their heads. They were coming from the trees, from the ground beneath their feet, from the very air around them. The forest itself was alive, feeding on their fear, responding to the call of the house. "I can't take this anymore," Matt said, his voice breaking. "I thought we were free. I thought it was over." "It's not," Charlotte said, her voice steady but filled with an undercurrent of dread. The house hasn't let go. It's still reaching for us. The world around them began to warp again. The trees twisted and contorted, their branches stretching toward them, the leaves rustling with a sound like whispers in the wind. The sky above darkened, the clouds swirling like an ominous storm, casting an unnatural shadow over the land. And then, as they looked ahead, they saw it. The mansion. It was no longer in ruins. The crumbling walls, the shattered windows, the decaying structure. They were gone. Instead, standing before them, bathed in an ethereal light, was the mansion in its full, terrifying grandeur. Is it real? Claire whispered, her voice filled with horror. Is this a trick? Charlotte's heart sank. It wasn't a trick. It wasn't a hallucination. The mansion was there, standing tall, its walls still covered in ivy, its windows dark and empty, as if waiting for them to return. We can't go back, Charlotte said, her voice trembling. We can't. We have to keep moving. This is part of it. The house is manipulating us. The mansion loomed larger, its shadow stretching over them, engulfing them in its dark presence. The whispers grew louder, the voices now clear, distinct, like they were speaking directly into their minds. You can never escape. You are part of us. Charlotte's pulse quickened, her hands trembling as she fought to control the rising tide of panic. The house had taken everything from them, their sanity, their memories, and now it was trying to take their very will to survive. Run, she shouted. They turned and fled, their footsteps pounding the earth, the sounds of their breathing, ragged and desperate. But no matter how fast they ran, the mansion was always ahead of them. The landscape seemed to shift, the trees bending and twisting in impossible shapes, the path ahead an endless loop, pulling them back toward the house. We're trapped, Alex gasped, his voice breaking with fear. We're back where we started. We're never going to get out. No, Charlotte said, her voice filled with determination. We have to break the cycle. We can't let it pull us back. The house is feeding on our fear. We need to face it. Face it? Matt whispered. What do you mean? We've been facing it since the beginning. We can't keep running. Charlotte's heart pounded as she turned to face the mansion once again. She could feel its power pulling at her, its malevolent presence wrapping around her mind, choking her thoughts. But she wouldn't give in. She couldn't. We have to face it together, she said, her voice firm, despite the terror gnawing at her. We need to break the house's grip. We have to find the source. The ground trembled beneath them as they made their way toward the mansion. The trees seemed to bend under the pressure, the very earth groaning in response. The mansion stood silent, its doors waiting, as if calling them to come closer. But something was different this time. The mansion was no longer just a building. It was a part of them now, a reflection of their fears, their desires, their darkest thoughts. I'm not afraid of you, Charlotte whispered, stepping toward the mansion. We are stronger than you. And with that, she crossed the threshold. The mansion stood before them, no longer a distant nightmare, but a tangible presence, its towering form looming over the group like an immovable spectre. The air around them was thick with the unnatural stillness that had plagued them from the beginning, and the world beyond its crumbling walls seemed to hold its breath, as if waiting for something. For the longest time, it had felt like the house was merely a backdrop, a labyrinth, a trap. But now, standing before it once again, Charlotte knew better. The house was not merely a place, it was alive. I thought we were free, Matt whispered, his voice hollow, his hands trembling as he stood next to Charlotte. The others were silent, their eyes filled with dread as they stood on the precipice of the mansion's shadow, its immense power pressing down on them like an invisible weight. "We were never free," Charlotte said softly, her voice barely above a whisper, her gaze fixed on the grand doors that had once been an entryway to their doom. She felt the tug at her soul, the pull of the mansion's influence, growing stronger the closer they got. "You can still leave," a voice whispered in the back of her mind, chilling her to the core. But she knew the truth. They had to face it. This was their last chance, and they could never leave until the house was destroyed. The mansion had followed them, bled into their reality like a dark stain they could never wash away. It had seeped into their minds, their memories, and their fears. No matter how far they ran, the shadows of the house had followed. "It's not just a house," Charlotte said, her voice a mix of fear and determination. "It's a part of us now. It's feeding off us." "Then how do we get rid of it?" Alex asked, his voice raw from the strain of everything they had been through. "How do we destroy something like that?" Charlotte looked at the others, the weight of their shared trauma hanging in the air like a suffocating fog. "We destroy its heart, the source, the place where its power originates." "But where is that?" Claire asked, her voice trembling. "Where do we even begin to look?" Charlotte closed her eyes for a moment, gathering her thoughts. The house had always been a labyrinth, but they had learned something during their time trapped inside its walls. The mansion was a reflection of them. It fed on their darkest fears, on their guilt, and their deepest regrets. It shaped itself around their weaknesses, and it had a history, one that had begun long before their arrival. "I think I know where we need to go," Charlotte said, her voice steady now. She stepped forward, her feet crunching on the broken ground, the remains of the mansion surrounding them like a desolate graveyard. "We need to go to the basement." "Wait," Matt said, his voice panicked. "The basement? That's where it all started. That's where Sarah—" "I know," Charlotte interrupted, her heart heavy with the memory of what had happened to Sarah. "But it's also where the heart of the house is. We have to face the source." She turned toward the others, her eyes filled with resolve. "We've come this far. There's no turning back now." With that, she led the way, pushing forward through the wreckage toward the crumbling entrance of the mansion. As they crossed the threshold, the oppressive atmosphere inside was palpable, the air thick with the remnants of its dark influence. The familiar sense of dread returned, wrapping around them like an invisible hand, squeezing the breath from their lungs. The hallways stretched out before them, twisted and unfamiliar, as though the house had reshaped itself in response to their arrival. The darkness pressed in from all sides, the shadows moving with unsettling fluidity. The air seemed to shift with every step, the oppressive weight of the house growing heavier, as though it was actively trying to repel them. "There's no turning back," Charlotte murmured to herself, taking a deep breath as she led the group forward. They made their way down the narrow, winding hallways, their footsteps echoing against the stone walls. The mansion's interior seemed to stretch on endlessly, its halls twisting into impossible configurations. The deeper they went, the more distorted the surroundings became. The windows, once large and grand, were now small, cracked, and barely letting in any light. The paintings on the walls flickered, the faces in them changing when they weren't looking. The mansion was no longer a structure of stone and wood. It was a living entity, its mind entwined with their own, pushing them toward the inevitable. As they descended further into the mansion, they reached a small door, hidden behind a set of curtains, a place they hadn't noticed before. Charlotte reached out, her hand trembling as she grasped the cold, rusted handle. "This is it," she said, her voice steady despite the fear creeping up her spine. The door creaked open, revealing a long staircase that spiraled downward into darkness. The basement. They descended into the depths of the mansion, each step heavier than the last. The temperature dropped, and the air grew thick with an unnatural cold. The walls seemed to close in around them, the oppressive force of the mansion becoming more and more suffocating. At the bottom of the stairs, they found themselves in a large, circular chamber, the walls covered in strange symbols, symbols that glowed faintly in the dim light. The air was thick with the scent of decay, and the floor was covered in a layer of dust that had not been disturbed in years. "This is it," Charlotte whispered, her voice barely audible. In the center of the room stood an altar, an ancient, stone structure, worn and cracked, surrounded by flickering candles. The symbols on the walls were part of an intricate pattern, and Charlotte could feel the pull of the house, the presence of something dark, something ancient, radiating from the altar. "This is where it all began," she said, her voice filled with sorrow and understanding. "This is where the mansion's power was born." The others gathered around her, their eyes wide with fear and confusion. "What do we do?" Alex asked. Charlotte closed her eyes, reaching out with her senses, feeling the pulse of the house beneath her skin. She could hear the whispers again, but this time they were clearer, louder, almost as if they were speaking directly into her mind. "You are mine. You will never escape." Charlotte swallowed hard, her heart racing. She had to do this. They all had to do this. She stepped forward, standing at the altar, and began to speak the words she had seen in the mansion's ancient books, the words that had bound the house's power to the world. By the blood of the past, by the darkness of the void, by the will of the lost. The room trembled as she spoke, the very walls vibrating with the energy of the ritual. The candles flickered violently, casting long, grotesque shadows on the walls. The air grew thick with power, and the house seemed to howl in response. But as Charlotte continued, the whispers became screams, louder and louder, until they were deafening. The shadows in the room began to twist and writhe, forming into monstrous shapes, reaching for her, for all of them. "You can't destroy me," the voice boomed, louder than ever. "You belong to me." But Charlotte didn't falter. She took a deep breath and pressed on, her voice ringing out with determination. "Let the heart of the house return to dust. Let the past be forgotten. Let the darkness be undone." The ground shook beneath their feet as the mansion screamed in agony. The shadows recoiled, and the air around them began to crack and splinter. The altar began to crack, its stone walls breaking apart as the mansion's grip on their world began to loosen. The house roared, the sound deafening, a final cry of rage as its power unraveled. The walls crumbled, the foundation shook, and with one final, deafening roar, the house collapsed in on itself, its heart destroyed. The air grew still, the room silent. The whispers faded, and the weight of the mansion's influence lifted from their shoulders. It was over. Charlotte stood there, her body trembling as the others gathered around her. The mansion had been destroyed, but they had all been changed, marked by the house, scarred by the horrors they had faced. "We're free," Charlotte whispered, her voice barely audible. "We're finally free." But as they stood there, the shadows around them seemed to flicker one last time, and Charlotte couldn't shake the feeling that the mansion's influence was not completely gone. No, it wasn't over. The air around them seemed to settle, but it was a strange, uneasy stillness that hung in the atmosphere. The mansion's towering form, which had once loomed over them like a living creature, had crumbled, leaving behind only fragments, a carcass of the terror it had once embodied. The walls had cracked and fallen, the floors had split, and the shadow of the house had finally been lifted. The silence in the room, the once oppressive weight that had haunted their every movement, was gone. Yet, despite the relief, there was something else that lingered, something that twisted at the edges of their thoughts. threatening to pull them back into the abyss. Charlotte stood at the center of the destroyed altar, her eyes closed, her breath shallow as she fought to steady herself. The others were close behind her, their faces pale and exhausted, the weight of their ordeal still heavy on their shoulders. They had confronted the house, they had faced its heart, and they had destroyed it. But as the dust settled around them, Charlotte couldn't shake the feeling that something was missing. Is it over? Claire's voice broke the silence, her words fragile as if she too was afraid that any noise they made would disrupt the stillness of the moment. Charlotte didn't answer immediately. Instead, she looked around at the remains of the mansion. The walls that had once been oppressive were now little more than a collection of ruins. But the feeling that something was watching them, waiting, still lingered in the air like a bad omen. I don't know, Charlotte said, her voice tight with uncertainty. I don't think it's that simple. The others exchanged uneasy glances. They had all been through so much. They had lost Sarah, watched the mansion swallow her whole, and experienced horrors beyond comprehension. They had faced their own fears, their deepest regrets. And now they were standing in the ruins of the house that had controlled their lives for so long. But even in the aftermath, they couldn't shake the feeling that something had been left behind, something that had seeped into them, into their very souls. We're free, right? Matt asked, his voice laced with doubt. The house is gone. It's over. Charlotte turned to face him, her eyes meeting his with a heavy sadness. I wish I could say that. But the house didn't just trap us in its walls. It trapped us in our minds. It twisted our fears, our memories. It's not over. Not yet. Alex stepped forward, his brow furrowed in confusion. What do you mean? We destroyed it. The heart, the house, it's all gone. We're free. Charlotte took a slow, steadying breath. The mansion might be gone, but it was never just a place. It was a reflection of us, of everything we're running from, everything we're afraid of. And that doesn't just disappear. It follows us. The others stood in silence, digesting her words. They had all felt it, the weight of the house's influence that had clung to them, even as they walked away from its ruins. The shadows in the corners, Charlotte continued, her voice low, as if she were speaking more to herself than to the group. The whispers in our minds, they're still with us. The mansion might have collapsed, but its grip, its influence, has been etched into us. Are you saying that we're still trapped? Alex asked, his voice rising with fear. That we're still part of it? Charlotte shook her head. No, not part of it, but part of its legacy. The house wanted us to face our darkest fears. It made us confront the things we'd buried deep inside. But it didn't just manipulate us. It imprinted itself on us like a scar. A heavy silence fell over the group as they each considered what she was saying. I feel it too, Claire said quietly. Her voice cracked with emotion. There's something wrong. Like the house left a part of itself inside me. I keep seeing things in the shadows, in my dreams. I'm the same, Matt murmured. I keep hearing voices, and every time I close my eyes, I feel like it's there, waiting for me. Charlotte turned to face them all, her eyes dark with a new understanding. It's not just the mansion, it's us. We've all been marked. The house was a reflection of our fears, and now it's part of us. It's in our memories. It's in our minds. We need to confront it. We need to let it go. The realization hit them all at once, and the weight of it was suffocating. The mansion had been an external force, something they could confront, destroy. But its true power had always been within them, their own fears, their regrets, the guilt they carried. But could they truly escape it? How do we let it go? Alex asked, his voice filled with uncertainty. How do we erase what it's done to us? The mansion's gone, but it's still here. He touched his temple, his eyes haunted. It's still in my head. We have to face it, Charlotte said, her voice quiet but firm. We have to face our demons. The mansion might be gone, but we've been carrying it with us all this time. We've been running from it, but now we have to face it. The key silence that followed was deafening, each person grappling with the weight of their own unresolved fears. The house had forced them to confront the darkest parts of themselves, but now it was clear that they could never truly escape until they had come to terms with those fears, until they had laid them to rest. Charlotte glanced around at the group. She saw the same fear in their eyes, the same hesitation. They had all been changed by the house, but they could still find a way to heal, a way to break the final bond. I know it's hard, she said softly, but we can't keep running. We have to confront what the house brought out in us, and only then can we truly be free. For a long time, no one spoke. Then, slowly, one by one, they nodded. They were broken, but they weren't beyond repair. They had been through hell, but now, together, they could heal. We need to go back, Charlotte said, a new strength in her voice. We need to face the memories we've been running from, and we need to let them go. The others nodded in agreement. They weren't ready to leave yet, not until they had faced the last remnants of the mansion's influence. The house had twisted them, yes, but they would not let it define them forever. They gathered their strength one last time, and together they began their walk back, toward the memories, toward the shadows, toward the final confrontation. The world outside the crumbling ruins of the mansion seemed deceptively peaceful, the sunlight breaking through the clouds as the sky cleared in the aftermath of the storm. The forest, once twisted and eerie, now appeared almost serene, its trees standing tall and unbroken, the wind rustling gently through their branches. But despite the calm, Charlotte couldn't shake the unease that still clung to her. The house might be gone, but the scars it had left, on them, on their minds, remained. The others were just as silent, their faces a mixture of exhaustion and fear, their bodies still bruised and scarred from the ordeal they had endured. They had destroyed the mansion's physical heart, but its presence lingered in the dark corners of their minds. It had preyed on their deepest insecurities, brought out their darkest fears, and for that, it had left a part of itself embedded in their souls. Charlotte stepped forward, her boots crunching on the broken earth as she glanced at the others. They were all with her, but she could see the lingering doubt in their eyes. They were hesitant, uncertain, still haunted by the mansion's echo. "Are we ready?" she asked, her voice steady but quiet, a reflection of the internal struggle she had been battling since their escape. "It's time to confront what's left." "I don't know if I can," Matt said, his voice ragged. He looked at his hands as though they still carried the weight of the horrors they had faced. "I thought it was over when we destroyed the house. I thought we were free." "I thought so too," Claire added, her voice distant. "But every time I close my eyes, I still see it, I still feel it. The house is still here." She placed her hand over her heart, her fingers trembling. "I can't escape it, it's inside me." "We're not going to escape it," Charlotte said, turning to face her friends. "We have to confront it. It's in us now, but we can make it stop. We have to face the things we've been running from. Only then will we be free." The words hung in the air like a fragile promise. But the truth was they didn't know if they could escape the house's legacy. They had walked away from its physical ruins, but its influence had bled into their very being, and now they had to confront it, their own fears, regrets, and the broken pieces of themselves that the mansion had exposed. "I've spent my whole life running," Charlotte continued, her voice strong despite the fear gnawing at her. "I've been running from my own mistakes, my own guilt. But I can't keep running. Not anymore." She paused, looking at each of them in turn. "We've all been running. From what we've done. From what we've lost. But we need to stop. We need to face it. And together, we'll let it go." The silence stretched between them, heavy and uncertain. But in the midst of that silence, there was a glimmer of something else. A realization. A shared understanding. The house had made them face the darkest parts of themselves. And now, it was time to confront it. Not in the cold, oppressive halls of the mansion, but in the quiet, open air of the world beyond. "I'm ready," Alex said, his voice breaking through the silence. His eyes were red, but there was a new strength there, an understanding that hadn't been there before. "We've been through hell together. We're not going to let it control us anymore." One by one, the others nodded. They weren't sure how they would do it, but they knew they had to. They had to break free from the mansion's grasp, truly break free. The mansion's curse wasn't just about physical walls. It was about their own internal barriers, the things they had kept hidden from themselves and each other. "We'll face it," Charlotte said, her voice filled with conviction. "Together." They turned and began walking toward the remnants of the mansion. But this time, the house didn't pull them in. It didn't try to trap them with its shifting walls and labyrinthine halls. It wasn't a physical place anymore. It was in them, an internal presence, a manifestation of their greatest fears, and now they were ready to face it. As they approached the ruins of the mansion's foundations, they felt a change in the air. The wind picked up, but it wasn't the same oppressive gusts they had felt before. It was as if the earth itself had opened up, revealing the deepest, darkest parts of their souls. The shadows seemed to flicker, no longer menacing, but waiting. "We need to face what's left inside us," Charlotte said, her eyes scanning the landscape. "The house might be gone, but we're not finished yet. We need to face what we've buried, what the house brought to the surface." She took a deep breath, turning to face the others. "We need to let go of the guilt, the fear, the anger. We've been holding onto it for so long. It's time to release it." The others stood in a circle around her, their bodies tense, their faces full of hesitation. But they knew Charlotte was right. They had been running from their own demons, trying to outrun the things that haunted them. The mansion had forced them to face the darkness, but now it was time to let it go. "I'm ready to face it," Claire said, her voice wavering but determined. "I've been running from my past for too long, but I can't do it anymore. I want to let go." "I've spent so much of my life trying to bury my mistakes," Matt said quietly, "but I know I can't run anymore. It's time to face them." One by one, they began to speak, their voices breaking the heavy silence. Each of them shared their fears, their regrets, the things the mansion had unearthed within them. They shared their stories with each other, their deepest wounds, the parts of themselves they had never allowed anyone to see. Charlotte listened, her heart heavy, but she didn't shy away from the darkness they all carried. Instead, she embraced it, embraced the raw vulnerability of the moment. They were all broken, yes, but together they could heal. As they spoke, the shadows around them seemed to grow softer, the air less oppressive. The weight of the mansion's curse seemed to lift, as though each word of confession was a step toward releasing the hold the house had on them. When they had all shared their deepest fears, their greatest regrets, there was a long, painful silence. But this silence wasn't the same as the one that had haunted them inside the mansion. It was a silence of understanding, of acceptance. Charlotte stood at the center of the circle, her voice trembling but strong. "We've faced the house. We've faced our fears. And now, we're going to let it go." She raised her arms, her eyes closed, and spoke the words that had been trapped inside her for so long. I release the guilt. I release the fear. I let go of the anger. I am free. And as she spoke those words, she felt a weight lift from her shoulders. The mansion's grip loosened, its hold on her mind, her heart slipping away like a distant memory. One by one, the others joined her, each of them releasing the burdens they had carried for so long. Their voices rose in unison, each of them releasing their own demons, their own darkness. The wind seemed to shift, and the shadows that had once surrounded them began to fade. In that moment, Charlotte understood. The house had never been about the physical structure. It had been about them, their fears, their guilt, their regrets. The mansion had forced them to face these things, but now they were free. The house no longer held power over them, and with that realization, the mansion, its influence disappeared. The air was lighter, the sun brighter, and the weight that had been pressing on them for so long was gone. They were free. But it wasn't just the mansion that had been destroyed. It was the darkness within them, the darkness they had carried for so long. They had finally released it, and with that release came peace. The first rays of sunlight crept through the broken trees, casting long golden streaks across the land. The mist from the ruined mansion had begun to dissipate, replaced by a soft, calming breeze that swept across the forest floor. Birds began to sing again, their songs a welcome reminder that the world, though scarred, was still alive. The sky above was a pale blue, unbroken by clouds, and the sun, though pale, shone brighter than it ever had during the days they spent inside the mansion. Charlotte stood at the edge of the clearing, looking out over the horizon. She could feel the cool breeze against her skin, the warmth of the sun on her face, and for the first time in what felt like forever, she allowed herself to breathe deeply. The weight of the mansion's curse, their shared trauma, had lifted. But something else had remained. A quiet, lingering fear, an uncertainty. They had escaped the physical confines of the mansion, but its shadow had not yet fully retreated from their minds. "I never thought I'd see the sun again," Matt said, his voice soft, filled with awe. He stood next to Charlotte, his eyes scanning the landscape. His face was drawn, still exhausted from their ordeal. But the relief was undeniable. They had made it. They had survived. "It feels surreal," Charlotte said quietly. "I keep expecting to look over my shoulder and see it, the house, the walls, but it's gone. We're free." "I don't know if I can ever feel completely free," Claire murmured, her voice small. She stood a little behind them, her arms crossed, staring off into the distance. Her eyes, once full of fear and doubt, now had the glimmer of something else, something quieter, more introspective. "The house is gone, but I don't know if I can ever escape what it did to me." "Same here," Alex said, his voice low. He turned to face the others, his expression troubled. "It feels like we left pieces of ourselves behind in that house. Maybe that's why it's so hard to feel free. It's not just the house that's gone. It's part of us too." Charlotte turned to face him, her eyes steady but full of understanding. She knew exactly what he meant. The house had shaped them, molded them, forced them to face their fears, their pasts. They had broken free from its walls, but the scars it left on their minds would never fully heal. "You're right," she said, her voice quiet but firm. "We've all been marked by it, but we can still move forward. We've been through hell, and we survived. The house is gone, and we're still here. That means something." Alex's gaze softened as he nodded. "Yeah, it does." But there was something else in his eyes, something darker. As much as they all tried to convince themselves that the nightmare was over, there was a quiet fear still lingering beneath the surface. They had left the house, but the house had left its mark on them. Could they ever truly move on? Or was the mansion still inside them, its whispers echoing in their minds? "We need to find a way to move forward," Charlotte said, her voice more resolute now. "We can't let what happened keep us trapped. We've faced our worst fears. We've broken free of the house. Now we have to heal. We have to rebuild." The others nodded, but Charlotte could see the doubt in their eyes. They were still haunted. The house had been their prison, but it had also been their teacher. It had forced them to confront the parts of themselves they had tried to bury. Now, they had to learn how to live with those parts, how to accept them and move on. "I know it's not going to be easy," Charlotte continued, her voice strong despite the uncertainty she felt herself. "But we can't keep running. We have to face the future. Together." They all stood in silence for a moment, the weight of her words sinking in. They had come so far, but the journey wasn't over yet. They still had to find their way back to each other, back to the world outside the mansion's ruins. "It's strange," Claire said softly, breaking the silence. "After everything, I thought I'd feel different. I thought that once the house was gone, it would be over. But it's like I'm still carrying it with me." "I get that," Matt said, his voice quiet. "There's still this weight inside me. Like I should be happy we made it out, but I can't shake the feeling that it's not over, that the house is still there just waiting for us to come back." Charlotte turned to him, her eyes full of understanding. "I feel it too," she said. "But that's why we have to move on. If we don't, it will always have a hold on us. The house is gone, and we have to start living like it." "But how?" Claire asked, her voice filled with quiet desperation. "How do you leave something like that behind? How do you just forget?" "You don't forget," Charlotte said, her voice calm. "You learn to live with it. The house showed us the worst of ourselves. It made us face the things we were running from. But now, we have to make peace with it. The house is gone, but we can still carry the lessons it taught us. We don't have to be defined by it." There was a long pause as the group absorbed her. Words. Each of them had been broken in their own way, shaped by the house's grip. But now they had a choice. They could carry the weight of the past with them, or they could release it. It wasn't easy, and it wouldn't happen overnight, but it was the only way forward. "I'm ready to let go," Alex said, his voice steady now. "I don't want to be haunted by the past anymore. I want to move forward." "I'm ready, too," Claire whispered. "It's been so long, but I'm tired of carrying it." "We all are," Charlotte said, smiling softly. "We've been through the worst, and we're still here." They stood together for a moment longer, the sole weight of their shared experience hanging heavy in the air, but with a new sense of resolve between them. They had faced their darkest fears, survived the horrors of the mansion, and now they had to face the future. Together. "We can't undo what happened," Charlotte said quietly, "but we can choose to move forward." One by one, the group nodded. They weren't sure what the future held, but they knew they were no longer prisoners of the past. The mansion had taken so much from them, but it had also given them something: strength, resilience, and the knowledge that they could survive anything as long as they had each other. "We'll figure it out," Matt said, his voice more confident. "Now, one step at a time." Charlotte smiled, feeling the weight of the past finally beginning to lift. Together. With that, they turned and began walking away from the ruins of the mansion. The road ahead was uncertain, but for the first time in what felt like forever, they were walking into the future, not away from their fears. As they walked, the sun continued to rise, the light breaking through the clouds, illuminating their path ahead. The world, once dark and suffocating, now seemed full of possibility. They had faced the darkness, and now they were free to find their way toward the light, and for the first time, Charlotte believed it, they were free. The road ahead stretched endlessly before them, but it was a road they had never walked before. The world outside the ruins of the mansion had seemed to open up with the promise of freedom, yet every step they took seemed to reverberate with a quiet uncertainty. Despite the brightness of the sun and the serene landscape, a weight still clung to them, pulling at the edges of their consciousness, reminding them of the dark past they were trying to outrun. Charlotte walked at the front of the group, her feet firm on the ground, but her mind still processing the last words they had shared. The mansion was gone. The horrors they had faced, the things they had been forced to confront, had all culminated in this moment. But something within her, a deep, gnawing feeling, told her it wasn't truly over. The house might have been destroyed, but the memories, the fears, and the darkness they had unearthed were not so easily erased. She glanced behind her, where the others walked in varying states of silence. Alex, his shoulders tense but his stride confident, seemed focused ahead, though Charlotte could see the subtle signs of strain in his face, small twitches of anxiety, the slight tightening of his jaw. Claire walked beside him, her steps light, yet her eyes constantly darted around, as though expecting something to jump out of the shadows. Matt, a few paces behind, looked as though he were deep in thought, his gaze unfocused, lost in some distant part of himself. The sunlight streamed through the trees, illuminating the path ahead. Yet no matter how much they had tried to escape, Charlotte knew they still carried the house with them. The mansion's grip hadn't been just physical. It had been emotional, psychological. It had peeled back their layers, exposing the rawest parts of themselves, the fears they'd buried for years. Do you think we'll ever be normal again? Claire's voice broke the silence, her words filled with a quiet desperation. She had been trying to hide it, but Charlotte could see the tremor in her hands. I don't know, Charlotte replied softly, her voice full of empathy, but I think we can try. The truth, however, was much more complicated. They had tried so hard to escape, to outrun the mansion's reach, but the mansion was no longer a place. It was part of them. No matter how far they walked, no matter how much distance they put between themselves and its physical form, it still lingered in the cracks of their thoughts, a constant whisper in the back of their minds. We can't keep running, Charlotte said quietly. We need to face it, one last time. Matt looked up, startled by her words, but said nothing. He had been quiet since they left the mansion, as though the very act of speaking might make the reality of what they'd been through too real to face. We're not running anymore, Alex said, his voice steady but strained. We're moving forward. That's what matters. But was it enough? Charlotte didn't have the answer. The mansion had taken so much from them, Sarah, their peace, their sanity. But had it truly been destroyed? Or was it simply lying in wait, buried deep within them, ready to resurface when they least expected it? They continued walking in silence, each step heavy with the weight of their past. The landscape, once so unfamiliar and unsettling, now felt like a strange sort of sanctuary. The road wound through the dense forest, the trees standing as silent sentinels, their branches heavy with the weight of memories. The air smelled fresh, like earth and rain, but there was something else there, too, something they couldn't quite place, a familiarity. Charlotte's thoughts drifted back to the moment they had left the mansion, the strange pull she had felt as they crossed the threshold. She had thought it was gone, that the curse had been broken, but now she wasn't so sure. It had left, a scar, a deep, lasting wound, and it was only a matter of time before they would have to face it, and face it they would. We're almost there, Charlotte said suddenly, her voice steady. The old road, the one that leads to the village. The others looked up, their attention drawn to the path ahead. In the distance, the familiar sight of the worn cobblestone road appeared, leading toward the small village where they had once hoped to find refuge. But as they walked closer, a chill crept up Charlotte's spine. The village loomed ahead, but it wasn't the peaceful, comforting sight she remembered. It was quiet, too quiet. No sounds of children playing, no chatter from the homes that lined the streets. There were no welcoming faces in the windows, no shopkeepers tending their stalls. As they entered the village, the oppressive silence swallowed them whole. The streets were empty, the houses dark, as though the entire village had been abandoned. "This isn't right," Matt said, his voice trembling as he stepped forward. "This place, it's not what I remember." Charlotte's heart skipped a beat. The village they had known had been a place of refuge, a quiet, peaceful haven where they could begin again. But now, it felt different. It felt like a shadow of its former self, like something had drained the life from it. "We need to stay together," Charlotte said, her voice tight with anxiety. "Don't let the silence get to you. The house has a way of twisting things, of making us see what we fear." They continued down the main street, but the more they walked, the more the world around them began to shift. The buildings seemed to stretch unnaturally, their windows dark and empty. The ground beneath their feet began to shift, the cobblestones uneven, as though the village itself were alive, breathing, shifting in time with their every step. "This isn't real," Claire whispered, her voice cracking. "This can't be happening." But it was. The mansion's influence wasn't gone. It had followed them here somehow. The silence, the stillness. It was the house, manifesting in a new form. Charlotte stopped in her tracks, her breath catching in her throat as the realization hit her. The mansion had always been more than just a building. It was a living thing, a force that fed on their fears and their desires. And now it had found a new way to haunt them. "We have to stop it," Charlotte said, her voice filled with determination. "We have to face it one last time. The house is still here, but this time we fight back." They didn't have to look far to find the source of the terror. As they rounded a corner, the familiar sight of the mansion reappeared, standing tall and proud, just as it had in the beginning. But now, it was more than just a physical building. It was a mirror of their own brokenness, an extension of everything they had tried to escape. "Let's go," Charlotte said, her voice steady with newfound resolve. Together. They approached the mansion, its doors wide open, waiting for them. They knew what they had to do. They had to face the final threshold, the last part of the mansion that had followed them into the world outside. But this time, they would not be trapped. They would not be broken. They stepped inside. The air was thick with the same oppressive weight they had felt in the mansion's halls. The walls seemed to close in on them, but this time, they didn't flinch. They had faced it before, and they could face it again. "You're not in control anymore," Charlotte whispered, her voice steady. "We are." The mansion groaned in response, its walls shuddering as though it were alive, its heartbeat pulsing through the air. But the group stood firm, together, united by the same resolve. With one final step, they crossed the threshold, and the house collapsed, its hold on them shattering completely. And then, there was nothing. The air cleared. The weight lifted. The mansion, its legacy, everything, it was gone. For the first time, Charlotte felt the world around her breathe again. They were free. The road ahead was long, but this time, the distance felt different. As they walked away from the ruins of the mansion, the oppressive atmosphere that had haunted them for so long seemed to lift. It was no longer the weight of the house pressing down on them, no longer the cold fingers of fear digging into their chests. But there was something else now, a quiet uncertainty. For the first time in months, The world felt like it was theirs to shape, theirs to navigate. And yet, even as they walked, Charlotte could feel the lingering presence of the mansion's legacy, still haunting the edges of their thoughts, still clinging to them like a shadow that refused to be cast away. The house had taken so much. Sarah, their peace, their sanity. It had twisted them, broken them, forced them to confront things they weren't ready to face. And now, with the ruins behind them, they had to pick up the pieces and figure out how to rebuild. There was no escaping the fact that they were different. The mansion had shaped them in ways they would never be able to forget, but it also had made them stronger, more resilient, more aware of the darkness within themselves. They could never go back to who they were before. But could they move forward? Could they find peace? Charlotte glanced over her shoulder at the others. Alex, Claire, Matt. They all moved with purpose, but their eyes betrayed the weight of the trauma they had endured. They had broken free from the mansion, yes, but they hadn't yet broken free from what it had done to them. The scars, both physical and emotional, were still there, still raw. The silence between them was heavy, each of them lost in their own thoughts, unsure of how to begin again. The journey out of the mansion had been long and grueling, and even now, it felt like they were still running from the past, running from the things they had seen, the things they had been forced to confront. "We should find somewhere to rest," Matt said, his voice breaking the silence. His words were simple, but the way he said them, tired, almost as if he were asking permission, spoke volumes. Charlotte nodded. "Yeah, we need to catch our breath, but we need to keep moving too. The house is gone, but it's still with us, and we can't just hide forever." The group nodded in agreement, though no one spoke. They were all carrying the weight of what had happened, unsure of how to move on, unsure of what to do next. They eventually found an abandoned cabin by the side of the road, tucked away in the trees. It was small, weather-worn, but it was a place they could rest. Inside, the air was stale, and the dust had settled like a layer of ash, but it was still shelter. It was still a refuge, and it felt like a brief, fleeting moment of normalcy in a world that had been turned upside down. They settled in quietly, each person claiming a corner of the small room. There was no need for words. The exhaustion of their journey had settled on them like a blanket, and all they wanted was to rest, to breathe, to find some semblance of peace. But even as Charlotte lay on the worn cot in the corner, her mind kept racing. The mansion was gone, but the memories were not. The nightmares had stopped, but the fear still lingered. Could they really leave it behind? Could they find a way to heal from the trauma that had been forced on them? Or would they carry the house's legacy forever? The silence in the room stretched on, thick and uncomfortable. The soft sounds of the forest outside were the only noise, a reminder that life, in some form, still went on. The world was still moving forward, even if they were stuck in place. "Do you think it will ever stop?" Claire's voice broke the silence again, her words quiet but filled with a deep, aching vulnerability. She was sitting near the window, her face pressed against the glass, staring out into the trees. "Stop what?" Charlotte asked, her voice hoarse from the silence. "The fear." Claire nodded. "I keep thinking about it, about the house. I feel like it's still inside me. Every time I close my eyes, I can see it. I can hear it. The voices, the shadows. It's like it's never really gone, like it's still waiting for me to fall back in." Charlotte sat up, rubbing her eyes as she tried to push the weariness aside. "I know," she said quietly. "I feel it too, like it's never really over. But it's different now. We're different now. We survived it. We're stronger than it was." "But can we really let it go?" Claire asked, her voice trembling. "What if it never leaves? What if it's always going to be part of us?" The question hung in the air like a heavy weight. Charlotte wanted to say something comforting, something that would make it all go away, but she knew the truth. They had all been marked by the house. And even though they had escaped, there was no going back to the way things were. The mansion had shaped them in ways they didn't fully understand, and they would carry its influence with them for the rest of their lives. But that didn't mean they couldn't move forward. It didn't mean they had to be trapped forever. "I don't think it will ever truly leave," Charlotte said finally, her voice steady, but filled with a quiet sadness. "But that doesn't mean it has to control us. We don't have to let it define us. We can keep moving forward. It might take time. We might never forget what we've been through, but we're still here, and that means something." The others were quiet for a long moment, each of them digesting her words. The house had been a force of destruction, a force that had torn them apart, but it had also taught them something. It had shown them their deepest fears, yes, but it had also shown them how strong they were. They had survived, and maybe, just maybe, that was enough. I think you're right," Alex said, his voice soft, but filled with a new resolve. "We're still here, and maybe that's all that matters. We made it through the worst, and now we just need to figure out how to live." Charlotte smiled faintly, the burden on her chest lightening just a little. "Yeah, we're still here, and that means we have a chance." They sat in silence again, the weight of the past still heavy but not as suffocating. The house, the horrors they had faced, the darkness that had haunted them, it was still there, lurking in the corners of their minds, but it no longer had a hold on them. They were not defined by their trauma. They were not defined by the mansion's curse. They were their own people now, stronger for having survived. As the night drew on, the quiet settled in, and for the first time since they had entered the mansion, Charlotte felt something resembling peace. It was fragile, delicate, but it was there. And for the first time in a long while, she allowed herself to hope. In the distance, the wind rustled the trees, and Charlotte looked out at the world beyond the cabin. The future was uncertain, but for the first time in a long while, she felt like they had the chance to shape it. Together, they were free. The world beyond the cabin seemed almost too calm. The sun, bright and warm, bathed the landscape in golden light, casting long shadows beneath the trees. The forest was quiet, save for the occasional chirping of birds or the rustle of leaves in the gentle wind. It was the kind of morning that seemed to offer a new beginning, a chance to start over. But for Charlotte, and for the others, it felt like they were still walking through a dream, a place where the rules of reality were uncertain, where everything was a little too still, too perfect. The road ahead was wide open, stretching into the unknown, but each step they took felt like a reminder of everything they had left behind, everything they had lost. They had destroyed the mansion. They had escaped its grip. And yet, there was no sense of peace, no sense of finality. The house might have crumbled, but its shadows stretched long behind them, following them into the daylight. Charlotte stood outside the cabin, her eyes fixed on the horizon. She had been trying to ignore the feeling, the lingering sensation that no matter how far they walked, the mansion's influence was still alive in them. It wasn't just the nightmares, the fleeting images of the house that crept into their thoughts when they least expected it. It was more than that. It was the way they had been changed, marked by the house in ways they hadn't fully understood. "I don't know if I'll ever be normal again." Claire's voice broke through Charlotte's thoughts. The words were soft, but they held the weight of an unspoken truth. Charlotte turned to look at her. Claire was sitting on a large rock by the edge of the cabin, her gaze distant. She had her arms wrapped around her knees, as though trying to hold herself together, and the vulnerability in her posture spoke volumes. "None of us are the same," Charlotte said, her voice gentle but steady. She walked over and sat down beside Claire, her eyes scanning the forest that stretched out in front of them. We've all been through something that most people could never imagine, but that doesn't mean we can't still rebuild. Claire looked at her, her eyes filled with doubt. You really think we can go back, that we can just live again? Charlotte paused, her thoughts drifting to the nightmare that had unfolded in the mansion, the horrors they had faced together. The fear, the uncertainty, the sheer terror, they had all been forced to confront the worst parts of themselves. But they had survived. They had fought through it, and now they had to move forward. I don't think it's about going back, Charlotte said, her voice low but resolute. It's about going forward. We can't undo what happened, but we don't have to let it define us. We've been given a second chance. Now we need to figure out what to do with it. I don't know, Claire whispered, shaking her head. I keep seeing the house. I keep hearing it in my head. It won't leave. Charlotte reached out, placing a hand on her friend's shoulder. It's not going to leave right away, she said softly. But that doesn't mean it has to control us. We control how much it affects us now. Claire turned to look at her, her eyes still clouded with uncertainty. But how? How do you let go of something that's been inside you for so long? Charlotte didn't have a simple answer. She could feel the same doubts gnawing at her, the same fear that maybe they had only scraped the surface of the house's influence. But there was something else there too, a quiet, stubborn hope. They had faced down something far worse than they could have imagined, and they had survived. They weren't the same, but maybe that was okay. Maybe they could rebuild piece by piece. I don't have the answers, Charlotte said honestly, but I know that we can't do it alone. We have to keep moving forward, and we have to keep facing it together. Claire nodded slowly, though her eyes were still clouded with doubt. Together, she whispered. As they sat there in silence, the weight of the moment settled over them. There was no simple fix, no magic cure. The scars would remain. The house had taken too much from them for them to ever forget it completely. But they didn't have to let the house take their future. They still had that. The others were beginning to stir from the cabin. Alex stepped out first, rubbing his eyes as he stretched, clearly not ready to face the world, but knowing it was time to take the first steps. Matt followed behind, his face drawn, a weary look in his eyes. They had all been changed, shaped by what they had experienced, and each of them carried that weight differently. Morning, Alex said quietly, his voice hoarse. He looked over at Charlotte and Claire, his expression distant but warm. What's the plan today? Charlotte stood up, brushing off the dirt from her clothes. She looked at the group, her thoughts briefly drifting to the road ahead. The future was uncertain, but they didn't have to face it alone. They had each other. And that was the first step, I think, she said, her voice firm. We start by taking things one day at a time. I'm with you, Claire said quietly, rising to her feet. One day at a time. The others nodded, and together they began to walk toward the forest's edge. The trees parted ahead, revealing a narrow, winding path that led further into the wilderness. It wasn't the familiar, comforting world they had once known, but it was a new beginning. A chance to leave the past behind and find something, anything, that could heal them. As they moved forward, Charlotte couldn't shake the feeling that the house's shadow was still looming, but she refused to let it define them anymore. They had been through hell, and they had survived. They had broken free from the house's grip, and now they had to rebuild their lives, piece by piece. And perhaps, for the first time in a long while, Charlotte felt the tiniest flicker of hope. It wasn't much, but it was enough. The group walked in silence, each of them lost in their thoughts. It was a peaceful kind of silence, though, the kind that existed in the calm after the storm, when the worst had passed but the echoes still. lingered. They had no illusions about the road ahead. They knew it wouldn't be easy. But it was theirs to walk now. As the path wound through the trees, the sunlight filtering through the leaves above, Charlotte felt a warmth spread through her chest. Maybe they would never truly escape the house. Maybe the memories would always be there, hidden just beneath the surface. But for the first time, Charlotte felt like they were walking away from the nightmare, not running from it, and that, she thought, was enough to keep moving forward. Charlotte didn't have a simple answer. She could feel the same doubts gnawing at her, the same fear that maybe they had only scraped the surface of the house's influence. But there was something else there too, a quiet, stubborn hope. They had faced down something far worse than they could have imagined, and they had survived. They weren't the same, but maybe that was okay. Maybe they could rebuild piece by piece. "I don't have the answers," Charlotte said honestly, "but I know that we can't do it alone. We have to keep moving forward, and we have to keep facing it together." Claire nodded slowly, though her eyes were still clouded with doubt. "Together," she whispered. As they sat there in silence, the weight of the moment settled over them. There was no simple fix, no magic cure. The scars would remain. The house had taken too much from them for them to ever forget it completely. But they didn't have to let the house take their future. They still had that. The others were beginning to stir from the cabin. Alex stepped out first, rubbing his eyes as he stretched, clearly not ready to face the world, but knowing it was time to take the first steps. Matt followed behind, his face drawn, a weary look in his eyes. They had all been changed, shaped by what they had experienced, and each of them carried that weight differently. "Morning," Alex said quietly, his voice hoarse. He looked over at Charlotte and Claire, his expression distant but warm. "What's the plan today?" Charlotte stood up, brushing off the dirt from her clothes. She looked at the group, her thoughts briefly drifting to the road ahead. The future was uncertain, but they didn't have to face it alone. They had each other. And that was the first step, I think, she said, her voice firm. "We start by taking things one day at a time." "I'm with you," Claire said quietly, rising to her feet. "One day at a time." The others nodded, and together they began to walk toward the forest's edge. The trees parted ahead, revealing a narrow, winding path that led further into the wilderness. It wasn't the familiar, comforting world they had once known, but it was a new beginning. A chance to leave the past behind and find something, anything, that could heal them. As they moved forward, Charlotte couldn't shake the feeling that the house's shadow was still looming, but she refused to let it define them anymore. They had been through hell, and they had survived. They had broken free from the house's grip, and now they had to rebuild their lives, piece by piece. And perhaps, for the first time in a long while, Charlotte felt the tiniest flicker of hope. It wasn't much, but it was enough. The group walked in silence, each of them lost in their thoughts. It was a peaceful kind of silence, though, the kind that existed in the calm after the storm, when the worst had passed but the echoes still lingered. They had no illusions about the road ahead. They knew it wouldn't be easy. But it was theirs to walk now. As the path wound through the trees, the sunlight filtering through the leaves above, Charlotte felt a warmth spread through her chest. Maybe they would never truly escape the house. Maybe the memories would always be there, hidden just beneath the surface. But for the first time, Charlotte felt like they were walking away from the nightmare, not running from it, and that, she thought, was enough to keep moving forward. The journey had taken them farther than they ever expected, farther than any of them could have imagined before the mansion came into their lives. The world outside the crumbled ruins of the house seemed almost too quiet, too peaceful. The air was clear, the trees thick with new leaves, and the birds had returned singing songs in the cool mornings. Yet, despite the serenity, The lingering sensation of something unfinished hovered over them like a cloud that refused to dissipate. Charlotte walked at the front of the group, her heart heavy with the weight of their shared journey. Each of them carried something different, but they all carried it with them. The memories of what had happened in the mansion, the unspoken fears, the things they could never erase. They had walked away from the ruins, but could they really leave the past behind? "It doesn't feel like we're truly free," Alex said suddenly, his voice breaking the silence. His words felt raw, cutting through the stillness like a knife. His tone was quiet, but the heaviness of his statement hung in the air, thick and undeniable. Charlotte glanced back at him, her eyes filled with understanding. "I know," she replied softly, her voice just above a whisper. "I feel it too. We're here, but it's like the house never really left us." The others were quiet as they walked, their steps slow, as though they were still unsure of where they were going, or perhaps unsure of what awaited them on the other side. The mansion might have been destroyed, its heart shattered, but its echoes reverberated through their minds, through their souls. Could they truly escape it? Could they ever return to what they had been? "I can't stop thinking about it," Matt murmured, his voice tight. "Every night I dream of it. The house, the walls, the doors, the whispers. It's like it's always there." Charlotte nodded slowly, her thoughts drifting back to the moments they had spent inside the mansion, the terror, the uncertainty, the feeling of being trapped within its walls. "It's not easy. I don't know if it'll ever stop, but that doesn't mean we have to let it control us." "We've already faced it," Claire added softly, her voice distant. "We've faced everything, but it still feels like it's inside us, like we can't escape it." Charlotte stopped walking for a moment, taking a deep breath as she turned to face them. "We can't erase what happened. We can't go back, but we can choose how we move forward. The house might have taken parts of us, but we're still here. We're still fighting, and that's something." Her words were met with a heavy silence, the weight of what they had endured sinking in. It was true, the house had taken so much from them, but it hadn't taken everything. They had survived. They had found a way out. But the scars, the memories, they would never disappear completely. "We can't keep running from it," Charlotte continued, her voice steady but filled with a quiet resolve. "We can't pretend like it didn't happen, but we can choose to move forward. We can choose to live." Matt shifted uneasily, his gaze distant. "But how do we live when it still feels like it's chasing us? Every corner, every dark room. I feel like the house is always just behind me, waiting." "I know," Claire said, her voice barely a whisper. "I feel it too, but we have to fight it. We have to keep moving forward no matter how hard it gets." Charlotte could feel the weight of her words. They had confronted their fears, destroyed the mansion's heart, but the real work had just begun. They were still broken, still carrying pieces of the house with them. And it wasn't going to be easy. They were all scarred, emotionally bruised, each one of them carrying a piece of the darkness that had once consumed them. But as they stood there on the road, uncertain of where to go next, Charlotte realized something important. The mansion had taken everything. It had stripped them of their peace, their sanity, their security. But it hadn't taken their will. It hadn't taken their ability to fight. And that, she thought, was enough to keep moving forward. The air had thickened around them, the shadows creeping in like an encroaching storm. The trees, once comforting, now seemed to bend and stretch unnaturally toward them. The ground underfoot felt unstable, shifting beneath their steps as if it were no longer solid but a living, breathing thing. The path ahead, once clear, now seemed twisted, warped by the lingering remnants of the mansion's dark influence. Charlotte took a deep breath, her heart pounding in her chest. The familiar, gnawing feeling of being watched, a feeling they had all carried since their escape, was heavier than ever. Despite everything they had faced, the mansion's shadows still clung to them. Even after their final confrontation in the ruins, the house had followed them here to this place. They had thought it was over, but the truth was undeniable. The house had never been about the physical walls or the rooms they had navigated. It had always been about the shadows inside their hearts, the dark corners of their minds that they were too afraid to face. "Is it still here?" Claire's voice broke the silence, filled with a tremor that mirrored Charlotte's own. She stood at the edge of the path, her gaze fixed on the trees ahead. "Is it still inside us?" Charlotte turned to face her, her eyes filled with the same unease. "It's not gone," she said quietly, "but we can't keep running from it. We have to face it, all of it." The mansion's influence had never truly left them, even after the house had collapsed. It was not a place. It was a part of them. The house had become the dark mirror that reflected their fears, their pain, their deepest regrets. It had taken so much, Sarah, their safety, their sense of control, and yet it had also left them with something they hadn't realized: the strength to survive, to move forward. And they had to accept that the battle for their freedom was not over. They had to face it again, but this time on their terms. "I'm tired of fighting it," Matt murmured, his voice raw with exhaustion. "I thought once the mansion was gone, we'd be free, but it's like I'm still trapped, still haunted by everything it made me face." Charlotte walked toward him, her expression soft but firm. "I know, I feel it too. But it's not about getting rid of it, Matt. It's about accepting it, accepting that it's part of who we are now." Alex looked toward the darkened path ahead. "We've been running from this for so long. Maybe it's time we stop running. Maybe it's time to make peace with it." Charlotte nodded, a quiet strength settling in her chest. "We've been through hell and we're still here. We've survived. And now we need to let go of the last thing that's holding us back." They all stood in a circle, their eyes meeting one another's, the weight of what they had shared now binding them in a way nothing else could. The house might have twisted their fears, turned them into something monstrous, but they had been through it together, and that, more than anything, was the key to their survival. "This is it," Charlotte said softly, her voice carrying the weight of their shared resolve. The final reckoning. They began to walk toward the heart of the forest, the path winding and unclear, but somehow they knew it was the right way. The shadows in the trees seemed to shift with them, curling and reaching out, but they no longer felt the same suffocating pressure they had before. The whispers that had once haunted their minds were quieter now, no longer filled with the same weight of fear. As they walked deeper into the forest, the world around them began to change. The ground beneath their feet seemed to ripple, the trees growing taller, their branches twisting and shifting. The air thickened with a palpable energy, as though the very forest was alive, watching, waiting. But this time, instead of shrinking from it, the group pressed forward. The mansion had taught them one thing: they could face anything, no matter how dark, no matter how terrifying. And then, in the clearing ahead, they saw it. The mansion, not as it had been before, ruined, broken, destroyed, but in its full, terrifying glory. The doors stood wide open, the windows dark and empty, as though beckoning them in. It was the same structure they had left behind, but now it stood not as a building, but as a reflection of everything they had endured. It wasn't the house that was haunting them. It was themselves, their fears, their regrets, the unfinished business they had never truly addressed. "This is where it started," Charlotte said, her voice barely above a whisper. "And this is where it ends." The others stepped forward, their feet heavy with the knowledge that they were about to face the last trial. There would be no escape this time, no running, no hiding. They had to face everything they had pushed aside, the guilt, the pain, the things they thought they had left behind. The mansion had taken them to the edge. Now it was time for them to decide if they would fall or rise. As they stepped inside, the familiar, suffocating atmosphere of the mansion closed in around them. The walls seemed to pulse with life, as if the house itself were breathing, waiting for them to confront it. The shadows stretched along the floor, the whispering voices growing louder, more insistent. "We have to let it go," Charlotte whispered, more to herself than to the others. "We can't keep carrying this. We can't let it define us." They moved through the rooms, the halls stretching out before them in a way they remembered. But the fear was different now. It wasn't the fear of being trapped. It was the fear of what they had never allowed themselves to confront. At the center of the mansion, they found the heart once more. It was a twisted, pulsing mass of shadows, alive and writhing, its form constantly shifting, changing, just as it had always done. But this time, they didn't flinch. They didn't step back. "This is the last part," Charlotte said, her voice steady but her heart racing. "We need to face it, all of it. If we don't, it will never let us go." They stood together side by side, their hands linked, their eyes steady as they faced the darkness in front of them. The shadows that had haunted them, the mansion's grip, had always been tied to their own fears, their own insecurities. The house had exploited their weaknesses, fed on their pain. But now they realized it wasn't the house that had power over them. It was their own fear, their refusal to face the truth, the lies they had told themselves. "We're not afraid anymore," Matt said, his voice low but filled with conviction. "We're done running." One by one, the group stepped forward, their feet moving in unison as they faced the heart of the mansion. The darkness tried to pull them in, but they resisted. They stood their ground. "Let it go," Charlotte whispered, her eyes locked on the shadows. "Let it go." The mansion groaned, the walls shifting and bending, but this time, the house couldn't break them. It couldn't tear them apart. The darkness began to dissipate, the shadows pulling back, retreating into nothingness, and then, with a final echoing scream, the house collapsed in on itself, crumbling away as though it had never been there. The air cleared, the tension that had gripped them for so long evaporating. It was over. The darkness was gone. The mansion was gone. And for the first time in what felt like forever, Charlotte felt something she had never thought she'd feel again. Peace. They had faced the house. They had faced their fears, their regrets, their pain, and they had come out the other side. The road ahead was still uncertain. The scars would never fully fade, but they were free. They had broken the cycle, and now they could begin to rebuild. "We did it," Claire whispered, her voice full of disbelief. Charlotte smiled, her heart full of a quiet, steady hope. "Yeah, we did." And together, they walked away from the ruins of the mansion, stepping into the future, one step at a time.